Chapter 2381. The doctor leaned forward so that his face was very close to Lan Yu's. He said word by word, "My name is Qin Chen. I'm Yi Muyun's youngest brother." Lan Yu squinted his eyes. Only then did he remember that Qin Mu did have a twin brother named Qin Chen. He didn't expect that the Qin family could raise a boy like this. He looked especially feminine. Qin Chen's face was still very close to his, so close that Lan Yu could see his overly beautiful eyelashes. They were long and curly. He didn't look like a man at all. At this moment, he had an illusion that this man was flirting with him. For Lan Yu, this was a great humiliation. His Adam's apple moved a little, and he said coldly, "You're not a homosexual, are you? Mr. Lan, you're thinking too much. Even if I were. Mr. Lan's looks are not within my consideration. So, please cooperate with the treatment, Mr. Lan. As for other improper thoughts, don't even think about it." Qin Chen smiled a little abominably. Lan Yu's face darkened. Shameless doctor. His eyes were obviously full of picky beans. Lan Yu's face was full of rejection. Qin Chen straightened his body and chuckled. "Mr. Lan, as long as you're obedient and cooperate with our experiment." "No, it's the treatment. I promise that it won't be particularly painful. I'll be gentle and gentle." Lan Yu gritted his teeth. "You quack." Qin Chen smiled. "If you can walk out of this ward now, the experiment on you will stop. But unfortunately, you can't even jump out." Lan Yu squinted and glared at him fiercely. "What do you want to do to me?" Qin Chen stood in front of the bed. His expression had the unique coldness of a doctor, but his face was very beautiful. Especially when the corners of his mouth curled up, there was a touch of naughtiness. Qin Chen smiled faintly. "The nerves in your legs are necrotic. So far, there hasn't been a single case that has been cured, so we can't guarantee the effect. However, the worst-case scenario is the same as now." Lan Yu's face was gloomy as he looked at the outrageously beautiful male doctor. "Is this how you comfort your patients? Did they complain about you?" Qin Chen smiled and lowered his body. "Mr. Lan's leg is broken, but his brain is fine, right? I'm threatening you, not comforting you, okay?" Lan Yu lay down and covered his head with the blanket. "Get out." However, the handsome doctor did not leave. Instead, he placed his hands in his white coat and said softly, "You need an injection. It might be a little painful, so, in order to prevent Mr. Lan from hurting himself, we have to tie you up first." Lan Yu abruptly lifted the quilt. He couldn't bear it anymore. "I'm not your test subject." He was wrong. This was not a quack at all. This was a black-hearted doctor. He struggled, but his legs were inconvenient and he was weak. 2 strong nurses were enough to subdue him. Lan Yu was pinned down. He was embarrassed and embarrassed. He had never been like this before. He was fooled by a doctor who was neither a man nor a woman. He must be a spy sent by Yi Muyun. The tall and strong nurse pinned him down, but it was also quite strenuous. Qin Chen walked over slowly with a thick needle in his hand. It was the kind that was used to give injections to pigs. Even Lan Yu was in a daze. He stared at him and panted heavily. "Let me go." "Treatment." Qin Chen smiled faintly. "Don't worry. It's just a little pain. I won't die." He looked at the nurse beside him. "Roll up your trousers." Chapter 2382. The nurse stepped forward, lifted the quilt aside, and then rolled up his trousers. However, the hospital gown was too long, and she couldn't roll it up. The nurse looked at Qin Chen with some hesitation. "Dr. Qin, I can't roll it up." Qin Chen glanced at it and said in a very indifferent tone, "Then pull it down from the top." The nurse hesitated. "Pull it down from the top," and it became one word. Wasn't it just to take it off? This wasn't very good. After all, Lan Yu was also a public figure. The nurse hesitated, and Qin Chen glared at them, and personally went to pull it up. His action was very rough, and with a swoosh, the nurse covered her eyes together. Oh, Dr. Qin, the coolest Dr. Qin in the hospital, did such an indescribable thing to Lan Yu. At that moment, Lan Yu's expression was also very interesting. After finishing, Qin Chen directly pointed the needle at Lan Yu's knee. And his face was actually frightened and pale. Qin Chen smiled. "Are you afraid of needles?" Lan Yu would never admit it, and his face was cold. "No. It's good that you don't. Because this needle is really painful." Dr. Qin coughed lightly. And Lan Yu, he was sure that he didn't hear it wrong. This black-hearted doctor's tone was with a touch of gloating. "God damn," he struggled, but his broken body, and the hospital gown that was pulled down to his knees, made him look extremely embarrassed. At this time, he even had the heart to kill him. When the thick needle pierced his skin, Lan Yu's forehead was full of beads of sweat, and his voice was also gritting his teeth. "I swear, as long as I can, I will definitely kill you with my own hands." Qin Chen focused on pushing the needle, and found time to smile, revealing his hateful white teeth. "Wait until you can walk." They were very close, so close that Lan Yu could smell the faint cologne on his body. A sissy doctor wearing perfume. Lan Yu glared at him, his eyeballs almost popping out of their sockets. But the pain continued. That piercing pain in his heart made him unable to say a single word. He panted heavily, his arm tightly pinched into Qin Chen's arm, so deep that blood almost came out. However, Qin Chen only frowned slightly. His voice was a little hoarse. "Mr. Lan, aren't you not afraid of death? Now you're acting like a woman." Lan Yu's eyeballs bulged. His appearance was completely different from his usual appearance. The nurse couldn't bear to watch. With Dr. Qin here, the patient might die from anger. However, look at how professional Dr. Qin is. His hand is pinched like this, but the needle is still stable. It should be known that this kind of needle that stimulates the nerves, if it deviates, there is no hope for Lan Yu's leg in this life, and it is very likely that his upper body will be paralyzed. The young nurses all looked at Qin Chen with admiration. Dr. Qin is the light of holy far away, a figure that even the director of the hospital is afraid of. At this time, their Dr. Qin pushed all the medicine in, and slowly pulled out the needle. When the needle was pulled out, Lan Yu let out another roar. Qin Chen straightened his body, slapped his hand away, and sneered. "Look at you screaming like a virgin, no one wants to force themselves on you." Lan Yu panted and fell on the pillow. He didn't care about his embarrassment, and while panting, he shouted, "I want to complain about you." "Go ahead." Qin Chen didn't care, only his eyes flashed with a hint of evil, and then he took off his mask. Just as Lan Yu thought, he was unbelievably beautiful, the kind that was even more beautiful than a girl. Moreover, he was very similar to Qin Mu, but with a bit more heroic. Chapter 2383. Lan Yu glared at him angrily. He felt that he couldn't do anything to this quack doctor. Qin Chen looked at the nurse and said, "Pull up his pants." Lan Yu was so ashamed that he wanted to die. Qin Chen must have been sent by Yi Muyun to torture him. Lan Yu lay on the bed and refused to talk. Qin Chen threw the syringe aside and wiped his hands with a tissue. He said calmly, "Mr. Lan Yu's brain may have some problems. Contact the neurosurgery department." Lan Yu turned his head and gritted his teeth. "Qin Chen, don't go too far. So you're not stupid. That's great." Qin Chen's voice was cold. He looked at Lan Yu condescendingly. All right, you can have a good rest. Try not to move that leg. I'll come back tomorrow to give you an injection. Lan Yu said coldly, I don't want to treat it anymore. If you don't want to, how can you chase after a girl in a wheelchair? Qin Chen smiled coldly. Don't be ridiculous. After that, he walked out. His back was handsome and cool. At the very least, the young nurses covered their faces as they watched. They cried out in excitement. Lan Yu pursed his lips and glanced at the two nurses. He said coldly, You like this sissy? The nurses covered their faces. Sissy. Our Dr. Qin is definitely not a sissy. The nurses said in unison, You'll know in the future. In the future. Lan Yu sneered. He was sure now. However, his sneer made the nurses dislike him. He was not handsome at all. He was weird. They should go see Dr. Qin. At least he was pleasing to the eye. The nurses helped Lan Yu tidy up his clothes and left. Qin Chen was outside. He held a notebook in one hand and a pen in the other. He looked at them and asked, Are you angry? The young nurse laughed. With Dr. Qin around, even if he doesn't die from the treatment, he'll probably die from anger. Qin Chen got up and smiled faintly. Don't worry. Lan Yu is like a cockroach that can't be killed. His heart for Tang Sher hasn't died yet. How can he be willing to die? After saying that, he shrugged and walked towards his office. The two nurses looked at each other, and one of them asked carefully, Do you think Dr. Qin did it on purpose? Where's the thick syringe? Pooh pooh pooh. Dr. Qin is the most upright doctor in our hospital. Why would he do such a thing? But it's not impossible. The two young nurses smiled at each other. Inside the door, Lan Yu was lying quietly, his whole body burning with combat power. He had to stand up and kill Dr. Blackheart with his own hands. Moreover, he really didn't give up. In the parking lot downstairs of Xingyuan, Yi Muyun held the phone in his hand. After quietly listening to Qin Chen's call, he tilted his head and looked at Cher, who looked worried. Qin Chen settled it. Shuer grunted in acknowledgement, then asked him, Did Qin Chen just come back to the country? Yes, less than a month. Yi Muyun rubbed her hair. Do you want to meet him? As he said that, he started the car. Cher said hesitantly, Haven't we already met? I don't think we have a private meeting. Yi Muyun smiled and held his chin with his fingers. He asked while driving, By the way, we should discuss the wedding date. He paused for a moment. It seems to be 8 years late, Miss Tang. Chapter 2384. Shuer's face reddened, and she snorted, I wonder who caused it. It's my fault for getting you pregnant. He smiled and suddenly said, Oh yeah, back then, did you get pregnant on purpose, huh? I didn't. Her voice was tender and soft, not convincing at all. And so, he knew. He didn't laugh at her, but his heart ached for her. His handsome face restrained his expression. Other than gentleness, there was also a tinge of heartache. He held her hand and didn't let go. Cher said in a low voice, I'm sorry, I didn't protect Ishu well. She thought that the child was gone, but she didn't expect that the child would be born in another way. Both of them were at peace. After a long time, she looked at him sideways. Actually, it's not just because of me. You're also very grateful to Lan Yu, right? Mr. Ye's expression darkened and he snorted. Really? He didn't want to admit it. She naturally knew the reason, so she smiled faintly and didn't say much. Yi Muyun clenched his fists and said in a deep voice, I won't let you go alone in the future. He didn't dare to think about everything that had happened to her in New York and how much pain she had been in. I don't blame you. She tilted her head and smiled sweetly. Her smile was like a ray of sunlight that illuminated his entire life. His throat rolled for a long time before he said hoarsely, "Okay." Cher smiled faintly too, tilting her head and watching him drive. The sunlight shone into the car and her face was so fair and clean that even the little hairs on her face could be seen clearly. At a red light, he stopped the car and looked at her sideways, smiling faintly. Yes, I'm quite grateful to him. So, when he wanted to kill Lan Yu countless times, he thought about how Ishu and Cher were fine while Lan Yu had become like that. He couldn't help but feel his heart soften. She was right. It wasn't just because she was unwilling, but because Lan Yu had really saved her and Xiao Ishu. The debts between men were usually settled clearly. From the beginning to the end, it had always been a scheme between Lan Yu and him, Yi Muyun. Zhou Chongguang was just an accident caught in the middle, or a chess piece used by Lan Yu. Of course, he also knew the principle of letting the tiger return to the mountain, and there would be no end of trouble in the future. However, he was still willing to do it. He would feel at ease, and Cher would be happy. Xiao Ishu would also be happy. What he wanted the most right now was to make them happy. The car slowly drove back to the villa. The little person was sitting in the courtyard waiting. His chubby little hand supported his chin. He looked extremely cute. The car stopped. As soon as Yi Muyun got out of the car, he saw the chubby little guy running back. It was obvious that they were throwing a tantrum. Cher looked at him and was a little stunned. She's probably unhappy that she didn't bring Lan Yu along because she knew that he had woken up. Yi Muyun's head hurt a little as he looked at Cher. You used to, let Lan Yu take care of her. Cher's neck drooped, and she cleverly kept quiet. Yi Muyun looked at her and said nothing more. He knew that he couldn't count on her too much. He walked into the living room slowly. Xiao Ishu was sprawled on the sofa as though she was reading a comic. However, Yi Muyun knew that she was pretending because the comic was placed upside down. Chapter 2385. Xiao Ishu looked at him in disbelief. Her eyes widened. You will let me see Dad. Cher happened to walk in at this time. She was a little worried when she heard Xiao Ishu's words. Because she knew that Yi Muyun actually longed for Ishu to call him Dad. She pursed her lips and was about to speak, but he had already held the little fellow in his arms. His voice was very light. Of course, he's your father, isn't he? Why wouldn't I let Ishu see her father? This time, not only the little fellow was surprised, but even Cher was a little surprised. When did his realm become so high? Yi Muyun's heart sank a little. If these years were indelible to Cher, then he could only accept it. His voice became even gentler as he coaxed the little fellow in his arms. But, Lan Yu is Dad, and Uncle is also Dad, right? The little fellow lowered her little face. She couldn't say it at all. Perhaps she was also feeling very uneasy. She looked up at Yi Muyun with tears in her eyes and called out softly, Yi Sansan. Yi Muyun forced a smile. He was a little disappointed, but he still reached out to rub her hair. In a few days, let Mom take you to see him, N. Xiao Ishu stared at him in a silly but adorable manner. Her voice became even softer. Really? Of course it's true. When has Uncle ever lied to you? Yi Muyun kissed her and held the little fellow in his arms. Perhaps it was a conditional exchange, so the little fellow didn't struggle and obediently stayed in his arms. Shuai looked at him and smiled faintly. She always felt that he was different and had become gentler. In the past, the way he handled things was often extreme. But now it was different. He had become especially gentle and humane. She thought that she liked him, and everything he did was for her and Ishu. She looked at him with a trace of infatuation in her eyes. Whether she was 8 years old, 18 years old, or now 26 years old, the one she loved was him. Her eyes shone with the light of the sun, filled with her love for him. Yi Muyun happened to look up at her eyes and smiled lightly. Xiao Ishu watched them flirt with each other, and her little body fell to the side, one great Qing, and one great death. His mother and Yi Sansan were completely together. Although she was Yi Sansan's daughter, in her heart, Lan Yu's papa was more important. Xiao Ishu secretly thought that Lan Yu's papa and mama would be together. Although this would make Yi Sansan sad, children were born not to like change. Especially when Yi Sansan forced her to wear a small skirt. She didn't like to wear a small skirt. The little fellow collapsed on the sofa, looking exactly the same as Cher when she was young. Yi Muyun directly looked at the child's mother. The meaning in his eyes was, "I'm giving you a look, feel it yourself." Cher also felt a little guilty, because this gene was passed down from her. She walked over and tugged at his sleeve. Her voice became even softer. "It's not a girl, it doesn't matter." His eyes were a little clear. "Then are you willing to have another son?" His little girl lowered her eyes and said in a voice like a mosquito, "I have to be able to give birth." Her body was no longer able to get pregnant. She knew that, she didn't dare to tell him. Chapter 2386. After saying that, she looked at him nervously, for fear that he would dislike it. She knew that he hoped to have a boy so that he could inherit the Boyi family. Besides, no one had the heart to force little Ishu to do something like this. Yi Muyun smiled. "If you can't have a boy, you can urge Xiao Yan to get married. I think his son will inherit the Tang family. No one will object." Cher raised her hand and asked, "Do you think his son will be willing if Xiao Yan doesn't want it?" Yi Muyun's face darkened. In the end, he was the only idiot who fought for power. What he did all these years was stupid. Cher knew that his face darkened, so she tried her best to please him and praise him. "Brother is the best. What about in bed?" He looked at her and asked blatantly. He did not hide it from the child. Cher lowered her head and bit her lips. "You are also good." Little Ishu looked at this and then at that, and then burst into tears. It was so hateful. Yi Muyun sneered in his heart. He could call Lan Yu daddy, but he had to know who the seed provider was. Cher glared at him. "Shameless." Mr. Yi said innocently, "Didn't you make her cry?" However, he soon laughed and picked up Xiao Ishu and kissed her. "Okay, don't cry. I won't sleep with mommy." Cher was speechless. Xiao Ishu was such a naive little creature. She was coaxed immediately and blinked her tears. "You really won't sleep with me?" Then the little girl completely forgot that she was a little boy. She blinked her tears. "Then Xiao Ishu will sleep with mommy from now on." "Of course." Yi Muyun pinched her little nose and smiled. "Uncle can satisfy all of Xiao Ishu's questions." The little girl looked at him suspiciously, her expression adorable. Snow, on the other hand, rolled her eyes. She could believe in anything else, but this was something she would rather die than believe. Was it possible for a person who was used to eating meat to suddenly become a vegetarian? She pursed her lips and stole a glance at him. As expected, he winked at her. Cher, she knew it. At night, Xiao Ishu was very vigilant and kept pestering her mother, not giving Yi Sansan a chance to take advantage of her. However, Yi Muyun did not show up. He left the little doll in her care while he dealt with official business in his study. He hadn't returned to the company for a long time and usually dealt with things at home. When he was done, he looked at his watch. It was already 10 o'clock at night. It was the time when children were asleep. He smiled and got up to close his laptop. Under the warm yellow light, he walked back to Cher's bedroom. He slowly approached the bed and saw the little doll sleeping soundly. Her little hands were holding her mother's body. It looked infinitely beautiful. Yimuyun reached out and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her quietly for a long time. The bedroom was quiet and filled with a sweet smell. Of course, there was also the smell of the little yellow bun. His heart softened. He couldn't help but lean over and kiss Xiao Ishu's little face. Then, he took a deep breath of the smell of the yellow bun. God knew how happy he was that Xiao Ishu was a girl. A replica of Xiao Axian. However, no matter how much he liked it, he liked his little wife more in the dead of night. Chapter 2387. Cher woke up and looked at him with her eyes wide open. Why are you here? At this moment, they had already arrived at his bedroom. Yimuyun pressed her against the soft mattress and kissed her while murmuring, I carried you here. Keep your voice down. With that said, he chuckled. Otherwise, that little one will cry again. Cher laid down softly. She was wearing a pure animal pajamas, and her black hair was scattered over her shoulders. It looked soft, no different from when she was 18 years old. As he kissed her, the urgency in his heart eased a little. Instead, he wanted to talk to her. As he kissed her, his voice was husky and charming. If Ishu is not willing, then, let her take the surname Lan. Cher's eyes widened, and she was a little shocked. Because she knew him. Yimuyun was a little domineering. To put it bluntly, he was domineering and possessive. How could he be willing to let Ishu take the surname Lan Yu? She was still in shock and forgot to speak. He kissed her and said with a smile, Are you silly? You still don't believe me, huh? At last, he kissed a soft piece of flesh behind her ear and bit down hard. She moaned and opened her eyes, which were filled with tears, and looked at him pitifully. You're mine. That's enough. He finally got to the point and his voice was even hoarser. Cher. She snorted softly and then hugged his neck, burying her little face in his neck to ease the overheated temperature. Her voice was also light, weak and helpless. His thin lips covered her ear, and his hot breath blew against her ear. It was so hot that it made her tremble in fear. Don't leave me again. After that, it was endless possession. Cher felt that he seemed to be going crazy, and she could only keep hugging him. The last trace of sweat turned from hot to cold. She moved uncomfortably in his arms. I want to take a shower. Yimuyun grunted, propped up his arms, and carried her easily. Finally, in the bathroom, he played 2 more times. When he came out, he gently helped her put on her pajamas, carried her back to her bedroom, and placed her next to Xiao Ishu. He propped himself up with one arm and kissed her lightly. His voice was hoarse. I really don't want to let go of you. He kissed her little mouth again and again, full of longing. Cher couldn't help but turn her little face away and snorted, unrestrained. He chuckled, his fingers gently caressing her little face. He was reluctant to let go of that soft touch and said in a hoarse voice, I just want to, and I'm a little exhausted. If you want, let's do it tomorrow night. Who's with you tomorrow night? You're shameless. Cher turned her face away, her small face was dyed with a touching expression. He smiled and pinched her little face. Then tomorrow morning, huh? After a pause, he smiled meaningfully. I can probably do it twice. Cher turned her little face back again. She glared at him and said incoherently, "Shameless, shameless, shameless. Where can I get a wife if I'm shameless?" He chuckled, his hands carefully propped up on both sides of her body, and kissed her again and again. His voice was warm as he said, "Good night, Cher." She hummed, as though she was a baby. He looked at her deeply, and he couldn't help but lower his head and kiss her on the lips. After the kiss, he didn't leave, but lingered for a while more. Chapter 2388. He kissed her affectionately for a long time before saying in a low voice, "I'm going out now. This little one is really annoying." Even when Daddy and Mommy made love, they had to do it secretly. After that, they had to send her back. Yimuyun turned his head and kissed his little girl as well. After that, his expression was very gentle. Before he left, he adjusted the lighting in the bedroom to the most comfortable lighting possible. Then, in the dim yellow light, he lowered his head and whispered in her ears, "Baby, are you happy now?" After asking that, he left and closed the door with a gentle smile. Cher laid in the dim yellow light while hugging Xiao Yishu. She felt really good. She felt really happy that he was like this now. Early in the morning, Xiao Yishu was the first to wake up. She raised her head and kissed her mummy affectionately. Just as she was about to hug her mummy to sleep for a while more, she noticed that there seemed to be some bruises on her mummy's neck. The television said that this was a hickey. The little one was stunned. Then, she realized that Yi Sanson had lied to her and kissed her mummy secretly again. Xiao Yishu turned around angrily and faced Cher with her little p*nis. She did not make a single sound, as though she was an abandoned child. Cher was in a deep sleep and did not notice anything. As for the little one, he was fuming as his fat little body curled up together. After a long time, his mummy still did not come to coax him. Hence, he turned his head and hugged her, before bursting into tears. Cher opened her eyes. She was really sleepy. The little one's cries were so loud that she had no choice but to get up in a flurry to coax him. Yimuyun came over as well. Perhaps he had just showered, he was only wrapped in a towel. Droplets of water dripped down from the ends of his hair, dripping down his body and onto the parts of his body that would make anyone want to vomit. Cher stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away. That plump little person was the same. He stared blankly with tears in his eyes. After watching for a long time, she suddenly burst into tears again. "Wow, such a good-looking Yi Sanson, Mom will definitely like him." The little girl was crying so hard that she was out of breath. Yimuyun went over and held her in his arms. Then he looked at Cher and asked, "What's wrong?" Cher looked confused and shook her head to show that she didn't know either. The little guy looked at them and started crying again. She had been crying for so long, but these adults actually didn't know what she was crying about. It was too hateful. Yimuyun hugged his beloved daughter, feeling both angry and amused at the same time. Xiao Yishu's appearance greatly resembled Cher's when she was young. She was truly adorable. He reached out and patted the little guy. His voice was especially soft. "All right, baby, don't cry." The little guy looked up and pouted. "From now on, I'll sleep with you." Yimuyun couldn't help but laugh, a deep smile appearing in his eyes. "All right." Then, the little guy opened its adorable eyes wide and looked at him. Cher watched from the side and covered her head with the blanket. She secretly sighed in her heart. Was she as dumb and adorable as Yishu when she was young? Was that why she was fooled by him? Yimuyun looked at the little guy lying down from the corner of his eyes and smiled. "Cher, I'm also very happy now. What should I do?" From that day onwards, Lon Error and Yi Sanson started to fight. At night, it was as if he was torturing an eagle. He opened his cute eyes and stared at Yimuyun. Yi Sansan, you're not allowed to sneak into Mummy's room after I fall asleep. Chapter 2389. Little Lon Error hugged him tightly. Yi Sansan's body was warm, and his skin was young and supple. She felt good hugging him. If Yi Sansan was willing to be Yi Sansan, she could still accept it. Little Lon Error thought to himself. As he thought about it, his little head moved like a chick pecking at grains, bit by bit. Yimuyun's gaze was filled with warmth as he looked at his little girl. 10 minutes later, the little girl finally fell asleep. She lay sweetly in his arms. Perhaps she was afraid of the cold, her little pink fingers curled up on his chest, as if to absorb the warmth. Yimuyun's gaze was extremely gentle as he looked at his little girl quietly. He kissed her, but still felt that it was not enough. Originally, he had intended to look for the child's mother. But now that he was hugging his little girl, he suddenly did not feel like moving. He just wanted to hug the little girl like this, to feel her warmth. Actually, it did not matter if her surname was Qin or Yi. As long as she was his child, it was fine. Moreover, this child had said that she did not want him, but now she was so intimately nestled in his arms. How could he not like her? Yimuyun's eyes were filled with tenderness. He hugged the little girl and closed his eyes, smelling her milky scent. Strangely, he fell into a deep sleep. At daybreak, the little boy woke up. She peeked and sniffed Yi Sansan's body. Other than her own scent, she did not smell anything else. She pursed her lips and hugged him tightly to sleep again. Yimuyun opened his eyes. There was a trace of a smile in his eyes. This little girl was still worried about him. His gaze was filled with the love of a father. Even though this child came unprepared and her gender was unclear, he still loved her. He loved her very much, just like how he loved Xiaoxin in the past. He carefully placed her in his arms and continued to sleep with a smile on his face. For the next few days, the little boy dominated Yi Sansan's sleep. These few days, Yi Sansan behaved himself and did not sneak into his mother's room. Hence, the little girl was temporarily relieved and continued to dominate Yi Sansan. Cher did not know whether to laugh or cry. But she was happy because she could not stand Yimuyun's excessive demands. His needs were as big as a beast's. That night, after taking a shower, she quietly returned to the bedroom and sat in front of the vanity mirror to dry her hair. The bedroom door opened softly and closed again. She looked at the person coming in through the mirror, turned off the hairdryer, and asked helplessly, "Is Ishu asleep?" Yimuyun walked in quietly and walked behind her. He leaned over and smelled the fragrance of her hair. His voice was a little vague. "Yes, she's asleep." "Then come back. She will wake up, or she will cry again," Cher said and turned on the hairdryer again. He took the hairdryer from her hand and smiled faintly. "He's in a deep sleep. He won't wake up anytime soon." He very naturally blow-dried her hair, his movements professional. Both of them were silent, and their eyes met in the mirror from time to time. She recalled everything, but the way they interacted now was different from the past. It felt like an old married couple. Cher's eyes were filled with tears. She took the skincare products on the table and gently wiped them on her face. Her gaze was on him in the mirror, and she asked in a low voice, "What do you want to do here?" Chapter 2390. He switched off the hairdryer and cupped a lock of her silky hair. He leaned over to sniff it and said in a low voice, "Tang shui, we haven't done it in 4 days. You've been going to the hospital every day for the past 4 days, huh? You were the one who agreed to sleep with Ishu." She was still sitting there, looking at each other in the mirror. He only had a bathrobe on, and his face was covered with love jade. He had no intention of hiding it. He nibbled on her neck and said, "Didn't you miss me?" As he spoke, he picked her up, swept away the skincare products with one hand, and carried her to the dressing table. The bottles fell on the floor. Cher covered her eyes and sighed, "It's very expensive." He stood in the middle of them and said with a chuckle, "I'll buy more for you." At this moment, he had no choice but to do it. She bit her lip and said, "Go to the bed." However, he chuckled and teased her. "Do it here once, and then I'll carry you there, huh?" Their clothes were very convenient. Omit 10,000 words. She bit his shoulder and said weakly, "Bastard." He chuckled. "I'm not a man if I don't do it." He was panting. "Am I a man if I don't use such a beautiful wife at home?" As he said that, he whipped her ruthlessly. Cher felt like she was better off dead. After one round, she felt like she was better off dead. However, the man who had been starving for 4 days wouldn't let her go so easily. In the bathroom and on the bed, he tortured her again. After that, he hugged her for a while and went back to his bedroom. Cher lay on the bed, gritting her teeth. This bastard. The next day, Xiao Yishu found that Yi Sanson was in a good mood. Later, she found that Yi Sanson was in a good mood every few days. However, the little fellow didn't have any evidence that Yi Sanson had sneaked out, so there was nothing she could do. However, Yi Sanson often sent her and her mother to the hospital to visit her father, so Xiao Yishu turned a blind eye. In her heart, Lan Yu was still the number one father. As for Yi Sanson, he was number 2. At Xingyuan Hospital, Yi Muyun sent Cher and Yishu to the ward. He didn't want to see his youngest daughter call Lan Yu daddy, so he went to the side to smoke. When he got out of the car to get the cigarettes, he happened to see Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang getting out of the car. Qin Mu's face was a little pale. When she saw Yi Muyun, she was stunned. Then, she smiled faintly, "Brother, why are you in the hospital?" "Lan Yu has been awake for a few days. I sent Cher and the others over to take a look." Yi Muyun lit a cigarette and smoked quietly. Then, he looked at his sister and asked, "What's wrong with you? You don't look well." Qin Mu pursed her lips and said softly, "I don't have a good appetite, so I came over to have a checkup." Yi Muyun nodded and looked at Zhou Chongguang. "Go with her. Let me know when you come out." Zhou Chongguang's expression was a little nervous. He didn't say much and just helped Qin Mu into the elevator. Yi Muyun looked at their backs with a deep gaze. He could tell that Zhou Chongguang was interested in Qin Mu. It was impossible for them to separate. Chapter 2391. He smoked his cigarette quietly and smiled faintly. In the elevator, Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang stood side by side. She whispered, "I'm not pregnant." "I know. I'm just checking." Zhou Chongguang reached out and touched her little head. His voice was quite gentle. Recently, his relationship with Qin Mu was very stable. Although it was not like that of other couples, it was still considered close for an old couple who had been married for many years. When the elevator reached the 4th floor of the clinic, Qin Chen was already waiting there. He personally arranged the best gynecologist for Qin Mu. Qin Mu went in for the examination, while Qin Chen and Zhou Chongguang waited outside. All these years, Qin Chen had been abroad. Even Zhou Chongguang was not familiar with him. Even the outside world did not know that there was such a child in the Qin family. If the possibility of pregnancy is ruled out, she probably needs to go to the gastroenterology department. Qin Chen's voice was very faint. Zhou Chongguang's expression was a little complicated. He told Qin Chen the truth, "I hope that Mumu is pregnant." Qin Chen was tall and thin, and his overly beautiful face looked a little lazy. Why? This doctor was too evil. Even Zhou Chongguang felt that he looked secular and rustic in front of him. Yes, this child of the Qin family who came back from America was actually several times younger than him. He was the same age as Qin Mu, and now he was only 22 years old. Apart from his young and good-looking appearance, he was full of ABCs. He was a very Western person. Although he did not speak English, he was a very Western person just by standing there. He was dangerous and charming. He was the kind of person that both men and women would like. Although he was the same age as Qin Mu, he was so experienced that he was 8 Wall Street ahead of Qin Mu. Zhou Chongguang found that he was actually looking for similarities between his face and Qin Mu's. When he realized this, he avoided his eyes in embarrassment. Damn it! He was really a strange person. Qin Chen looked at him with a lazy smile, as if he had seen through everything. At that moment, Zhou Chongguang was in a mess, and he secretly decided to keep Mumu away from the twins in the future. How could there be such a big difference between the twins? How pure his Mumu was! After waiting for a long time, the two of them did not say anything else. When Qin Mu came out, her expression said it all. She wasn't pregnant. It's okay. Zhou Chongguang comforted her gently. Qin Chen arranged other tests for the gastroenterology department, and there were no problems. Qin Chen went to talk with the gynecologist for a while, and then he came over and said lightly, "It's okay." He patted Qin Mu's shoulder. "Relax, don't put too much pressure on yourself, alright?" Qin Mu. Qin Chen gave her a hug and said, "I'm here." He said a few more words to Zhou Chongguang and sent them away. Then he went back to the gynecology department to see the doctor. The female doctor left and closed the door. When she looked back at Qin Chen, she sighed softly. Qin Chen, who had always been a little cynical, also looked a little nervous. "Is the situation not good?" The female doctor nodded and said seriously, "Not very good." She pursed her lips and then continued, "Her uterus has a cold disease, so it's not easy for her to get pregnant." Qin Chen put his hand in his white coat. "Dr. Bai, can she recuperate?" Chapter 2392. Dr. Bai sighed softly. She didn't treat herself well when she was young, and that's why she got sick. Illness is like spinning silk. You need to be patient and don't give her any pressure. Qin Chen replied. "Dr. Bai, you know that our family doesn't lack Qin Mu to give birth to a child. As for Zhou Chongguang, if Qin Mu's only meaning to him was to give birth to a child, then this marriage was dispensable." Dr. Bai's relationship with the Qin family was not deep, but she knew Qin Chen. He looked carefree and didn't care about anything, but deep down, he was very concerned about Qin Mu. She sighed in her heart again. After all, they came out of the same womb. Their relationship was indeed different. Dr. Bai prescribed some warm and nourishing medicine. It was not harmful, and she didn't need to stop taking the medicine to get pregnant. Qin Chen took the medicine and smiled faintly. "Thank you." After that, he walked out. Dr. Bai looked at the tall and thin back view of him and shook her head gently. How could such a good-looking girl think of herself as a man? Qin Chen walked to the stairwell and leaned against the wall. He squinted his eyes and looked at the prescription. At this moment, someone stood beside him. He looked sideways and saw that it was Yi Muyun. "Brother." Qin Chen's voice was a little muffled. He threw the prescription in his hand to him and said calmly, "Qin Mu's illness." Yi Muyun took the prescription and looked at it carefully for a minute. He looked up. "Does she know about it?" "I don't know." Qin Chen leaned against the wall and tilted his head. "I don't want to tell her." "Tell Zhou Chongguang and see what he says." Yi Muyun nodded in agreement and passed the prescription back to him. It's a good idea. I'll leave it to you. You're the doctor, so you're the most suitable person to do this. Qin Chen narrowed his eyes. Brother. Don't you think it's more suitable for Qin Mu to live with you all these years? I don't get along well with Zhou Chongguang. Besides, you're a doctor. You're a professional. Yi Muyun's voice was calm, and he pushed it back. Qin Chen cursed, fuck. Not even grass. Yi Muyun said softly, also, be more refined. Have you really considered yourself a man after all these years? Qin Chen took the prescription and left as if he had seen a ghost. Yi Muyun smiled and rubbed the space between his eyebrows. He felt a headache coming on. Yes, both of his sisters had a headache. In the past, he thought that the twins were fake, but both of them were girls. He didn't know who thought that the little bump on Qin Chen's body when he was born was that thing. However, Mr. Yi immediately thought of the little yellow boy at home. He didn't seem to be any better. He was only 5 years old, but he didn't listen to others. Mr. Yi thought seriously that he should use Qin Chen as a negative example. If he asked Qin Chen to take off his male clothes in front of Xiao Yishu, Qin Chen probably wouldn't agree. Mr. Yi still felt a headache. On the other side, Qin Chen walked to a quiet place and sent a message to Zhou Chongguang, arranging to meet alone at 9:00 in the evening. He put away his phone and quietly looked at the list in his hand. Then he walked to the top floor of the inpatient department. He pushed open the door to Lan Yu's ward, and the atmosphere was really weird. Cher was curled up on the sofa playing games, Xiao Yishu was trying her best to tease Lan Yu, and Lan Yu still looked like he had nothing to live for. Qin Chen chuckled and walked over with his hands still in his pockets. Chapter 2393. He bent down to get close to Xiao Yishu's face and said with a smile, "Are you Yi Muyun's little bun?" Not to mention Xiao Yishu, even Cher didn't quite know who Qin Chen was. For a moment, she just stood there. Qin Chen smiled, "I'm Mr. Ye's younger brother." As he spoke, his fingers were still holding the little yellow bun. He even leaned over to smell it, but he turned his head and said to Cher, "My brother used to be obsessed with the smell of your body. It's really perverted, but you don't smell like you've been weaned." Cher blushed. After all, he was her brother-in-law. Was he flirting with her? Qin Chen smiled charmingly, "But sister-in-law has grown up. She's quite beautiful, and I like her very much." Before he finished speaking, Lan Yu, who was lying on the sickbed, threw a book at him. "Get out." Lan Yu hated this black-hearted doctor. He felt that if there was no doctor named Qin Chen in this world, the air would be much fresher. Qin Chen dodged it easily, with one hand still in his pocket, and said with a faint smile, "I dare to express it. Unlike some people who clearly like you, after 5 years, they make themselves like a eunuch." Lan Yu's dark face turned green. Originally, when Xiao Yishu and Cher came over, although he didn't want to, he was secretly happy in his heart. However, this little bit of happiness was completely destroyed by this black-hearted doctor. At this moment, Lan Yu wanted to chop Qin Chen to pieces. This black-hearted doctor not only insulted his physique, but also his character. Eunuch. When Lan Yu wanted to refute, Cher said in a low voice, "He's not." There was silence. At this moment, Cher bit her lips and said, "He has another woman." Qin Chen almost laughed. And Lan Yu almost fainted. He might as well not explain to her. Qin Chen's fingers gently let go of Xiao Yishu, and the little yellow bun fell on the sickbed, right on Lan Yu's injured leg. It was quite miserable. Then, Qin Chen, quack Dr. Qin, leaned over and stuck his pretty face on Lan Yu's face. He smiled wickedly. "So, Mr. Lan is secretly eating." Lan Yu was furious and stared at him. Qin Chen smiled happily and picked up the little yellow bun again. He said lightly, "Well, it's visiting time. Sister-in-law, take Ishu downstairs. Big brother is still waiting for you." Every word he said stabbed Lan Yu's heart, and Lan Yu lay down directly. And Qin Chen threw the little guy into Cher's arms, and blinked. "Mr. Lan's treatment time is up. For the sake of Mr. Lan's dignity, don't watch the treatment process." How pitiful. Cher looked at Lan Yu on the sickbed sympathetically. She had an illusion that Lan Yu seemed to bury his head again. Would he be tortured by Qin Chen until he became insane? She thought. Qin Chen smiled. "Don't worry, sister-in-law. I'm good at it." Cher looked solemn, and looked at Lan Yu sympathetically. Xiao Yishu looked innocent. "Dad, you have to cooperate with the doctor for the injection." Lan Yu smiled reluctantly. "Son, you don't know how thick this black-hearted doctor's needles are. They are the kind used for pigs." "Forget it, son. Anyway, you have never seen a pig." Chapter 2394. Qin Chen sat beside him and smiled. "One of your legs is crippled, but you're still so obsessed with one thing." Lan Yu's face turned dark red and became the color of pig liver. Thinking of how down and out the world-class painter Lan Yu was now, it was really lamentable. "What do you want, black-hearted doctor?" Qin Chen smiled meaningfully. "I forgot that you don't look at yourself in the mirror. If you look at yourself in the mirror, you'll know that I won't have any bad thoughts about you." Lan Yu was already lucky that he didn't pass out. After Qin Chen finished speaking, he looked at Lan Yu quietly with a deep gaze. Lan Yu felt goosebumps. He felt that Qin Chen's gaze could penetrate his soul. Qin Chen smiled. "All right, I won't be giving you an injection today. I'll give you a massage." Lan Yu looked at him suspiciously. Would he be so kind as to let go of the opportunity to torture him? In Lan Yu's heart, he had already given up the hope of leaving the hospital. He was just waiting, living one day at a time. He wanted to see how many methods this beautiful sissy black-hearted doctor had to torture and humiliate him. Qin Chen looked at him and smiled. "There's no need for a nurse today. I'll do it myself." Lan Yu pursed his lips and gritted his teeth. "What do you want now?" "Treatment. I want to see if that part of yours is still working." Qin Chen smiled wickedly. The muscles on Lan Yu's thin face kept twitching. He really couldn't accept being examined by a man. However, Qin Chen's hands were very fast and steady, as if he had done this thousands of times. He took off the hospital gown swiftly and said calmly, "I've minored in andrology." Her gaze shifted upwards and landed on Lan Yu's face. Then, she said something that would make Lan Yu feel ashamed for the rest of his life. "It's been so long since you woke up, but you haven't gotten up, have you?" The veins on Lan Yu's forehead bulged as he forced out a few words. "Get out of here." "Calm down." Qin Chen pressed his shoulder down easily. "Being irritable isn't good for your recovery." Lan Yu breathed heavily and said unhappily, "But you've always been making me angry. Arouse your survival instincts. But you have to restrain yourself." Qin Chen raised an eyebrow, then put on a mask and gloves. Lan Yu gritted his teeth. "Am I that dirty?" "In my eyes, this is just a lesion." Qin Chen's voice was very calm. At this time, his eyes were sharp and professional. He did not look like a black-hearted doctor at all. Then, Lan Yu closed his eyes and endured the examination of the handsome male doctor. This process was simply torture for him. Qin Chen's movements were very professional. He did not avoid his gaze and even tried to use professional methods to test. Of course, Lan Yu still couldn't do it. After about 10 minutes of examination, Qin Chen ended the examination. His tone was very calm. Probably not for the time being. The root of the disease is not here. It's still this leg. Lan Yu just looked at her, unable to tell whether he was sad or happy. Qin Chen paused for a moment before slowly taking off his gloves. He said calmly, in other words, if the nerve in your leg is really necrotic, then you'll be a eunuch. Lan Yu was originally very calm, but after hearing this, anyone would be furious. Is this how you comfort a patient? Chapter 2395. Qin Chen laughed happily and threw the glove on his face. Take a good whiff of your own scent. After saying that, he put his hands in his pockets and walked out leisurely. The door closed and an angry voice came from inside. Quack! Qin Chen smiled, pushed the hair on his forehead, and walked toward the elevator. The young nurses passing by looked at him eagerly. God, Dr. Qin is so handsome. Dr. Qin was the #1 male god of Xingyuan Hospital. Every move he made was extremely handsome, just like the Li Zian in the game that made him fall in love with the game producer. His eyes were simply electrifying. When he was in love, it was simply unimaginable how charming he was. When he called baby, they would probably fly to heaven. Qin Chen walked into the elevator under the adoring eyes of a group of young nurses. He had long been accustomed to the adoration and worship of women. When he turned around in the elevator, the young nurses inexplicably felt that he looked like Bai Qi. Oh my God, so handsome. In the ward, Lan Yu once again felt hopeless. After work, Qin Chen took out the piece of paper from his white coat and looked at it for a long time. Although he had an appointment with Zhou Chongwang at 9 o'clock, he arrived at the night bar before 8 o'clock. He ordered a glass of white martell, listened to the music, and casually smoked. He did not smoke much, about 2 or 3 cigarettes in an hour. Qin Chen had a mixture of bad and arrogant aura, which was very attractive to young girls, especially today when he took off his thin coat and wore a black shirt with 2 buttons unbuttoned, revealing his delicate collarbone. Delicate was the impression that Qin Chen gave people, but not feminine. His beauty was particularly natural. He was a man who was insanely good-looking. Of course, there were many women who came over because Qin Chen was wearing the world's top brands and his temperament showed that he came from a good family. He looked like a diamond man. However, he was very cold, and those women returned empty-handed. When Zhou Chongwang came over, he saw a woman leaving angrily. He couldn't help but smile. He walked over, took off his coat, and sat opposite Qin Chen. What's wrong? Aren't you interested in that woman? He only knew that Qin Chen had been studying medicine in the United States and was a genius doctor. But didn't they say that the more talented a doctor was, the more pressure he would feel? Qin Chen glanced at him and didn't say anything. He just raised his hand to beckon the waiter. Give this gentleman a glass of whiskey. Zhou Chongwang originally wanted to refuse, but it was rare for his brother-in-law to ask him out. Although this brother-in-law didn't seem to be a good person, he was much easier to deal with than Yumuyun. As Zhou Chongwang thought of this, he didn't say anything. After a while, the waiter brought the wine over. He took a sip and looked up. What's the matter? Qin Chen took out another cigarette, put it on his lips, and tilted his head. Haven't you already guessed it? Zhou Chongwang smiled bitterly. It's Qin Mu, isn't it? Qin Chen only cared about smoking. After about half a cigarette, he took out a piece of paper. This was prescribed by today's doctor. Qin Mu's uterus is cold, and it's difficult for her to get pregnant. She needs to take care of it slowly. When Zhou Chongwang was stunned, he slowly said, also, Qin Mu's psychological pressure is too great. His eyes were burning. If there's a next time, Zhou Chongguang, don't ever think about seeing her again. Chapter 2396. Actually, he and Qin Mu had been together for a long time without using contraception, so he knew that there must be something wrong. However, he didn't expect that the youngest member of the Qin family was no easier to deal with than Yi Muyun. She was so sharp. He was silent for a long time before saying in a low voice, "What I care about the most isn't the child." "I hope so." Qin Chen's voice was indifferent. He then put out his cigarette and stood up. "Let's go." Zhou Chongguang stopped him, looking hesitant. "Oh yes, I have a cousin who studies music. She's about the same age as you. Do you want to introduce her to me?" He was admitting that he was trying to rope him in. Qin Chen put on his coat and frowned slightly. He then turned to look at Zhou Chongguang. "I have no intention of getting a girlfriend." Zhou Chongguang was a little stunned. Could it be that Qin Chen was a G? When he returned to the villa, he couldn't tell Qin Mu what was on his mind. Instead, he talked about Qin Chen. Zhou Chongguang asked Qin Mu tentatively, asking her if Qin Chen's sexual orientation was normal. Qin Mu lay on the bed and laughed for a long time. She laughed so hard that she was about to cry. Zhou Chongguang propped himself on both sides of her body and pinched her chin with one hand. He said in a deep voice, "How dare you laugh at me, huh?" Qin Mu hooked her arms around his neck. "Why don't you guess? Why doesn't he get a girlfriend?" Zhou Chongguang looked at her suspiciously. "I can't think of any other reason other than a G." Qin Mu leaned close to his ear and said softly, "Because he's a girl." "How do you expect him to get a girlfriend?" Zhou Chongguang's expression looked like he had eaten something. He narrowed his eyes. "Really? How could this be possible?" Although Qin Chen was excessively beautiful, her manly aura, slightly evil appearance, and clothes made her look like a man. It didn't seem out of place at all. Moreover, he and Mu were born together. Qin Mu, suddenly, Zhou Chongguang felt as if he was struck by lightning. He forgot that Qin Mu also had 172. It wasn't unusual for Qin Chen to be around 175 centimeters tall, and they were both tall and thin. If they had been raised as boys, it would indeed be hard to tell them apart. Zhou Chongguang rolled to the side and covered his eyes with the back of his hand. He sighed. How did she do it? Really, he couldn't tell at all. Qin Mu laid on his chest and replied softly, "Yes. For many years, she has always been like this, and since she was young, many girls have liked her." Zhou Chongguang secretly cursed her as a pervert in his heart. Then he turned his head to look at his little wife and asked very seriously, "Does he go to the men's bathroom or the women's bathroom?" Qin Mu pinched his arm. "You have to ask Qin Chen. I wouldn't dare." Zhou Chongguang sighed. He's not to be trifled with. He still thought that Qin Chen was a man. Yes, he would treat him as a brother. It was better not to know. After asking about Qin Chen, he thought of the prescription that Qin Chen had given him. It was all Chinese medicine. He had already secretly grabbed the medicine, and the rest was to find a way to trick Mu into drinking it. Zhou Chongguang propped up half of his body and looked at Qin Mu seriously. "I plan to take a month off during the new year. We don't want children for the time being. I want to take you out for a walk." Qin Mu looked at him in shock. He was a little surprised, and then he said slowly, "Didn't you want a child before?" Chapter 2397. He kissed her and said passionately, "I suddenly realized that I haven't had enough fun yet. Mu, let's play for another 2 years, okay?" Qin Mu was kissed by him and couldn't break free. She could only hit his shoulder with her little hand and said intermittently, "The wind is, the rain." After kissing for a while, he moved his thin lips to her ear and said hoarsely, "After thinking about it, my wife is still the most fun." Qin Mu turned her face away and bit his chin. Bad guy. Zhou Chongguang's gaze was deep. He propped himself up and looked at her deeply. His voice was also hoarse. "Do you like bad guys?" Qin Mu looked disgusted. "You smell of alcohol. Get lost." He chuckled softly and easily folded her in his arms, kissing her forcefully. When it came to sex, even 10 Qin Mus were no match for him. Soon, she softened into a pool of water and was at his mercy. Vaguely, she felt that he had taken the tea. Qin Mu held his hand and frowned. "If we have it, we won't go out. It's the same in B City. Mrs. Zhou, I've changed my mind. I want to play for another 2 years." He leaned close to her ear and said passionately. At the same time, he sealed her little mouth so that she wouldn't have a chance to speak again. After a few times, they were finally exhausted. After lying together for a while, Zhou Chongguang carefully carried her to the bathroom and treated her as if he was serving a princess. Recently, he was quite infatuated with his wife and couldn't bear to let go of her. Sometimes, Qin Mu would find him annoying and felt that a layer of her skin was about to fall off. She patted his hand and said weakly, "Zhou Chongguang, that's enough. Don't come again." She was really afraid of him. He was a 28-year-old man, and his physical strength was abnormally good. He could stay up for a night, but she didn't have such good physical strength to accompany him. Sometimes, when Qin Mu was angry, she would kick him and ask him to go outside to find a woman to solve his problem. But every time she said that, he would probably peel off a layer of her skin that night. Later on, when Zhou Chongguang was torturing her, he would tease her. As he tormented her, he would murmur, "Baby, you said that because you want me to torture you like this, right?" At that moment, Qin Mu even had the thought of killing him. After a long time, she really understood that although Zhou Chongguang looked gentle, he was actually a carnivore. It must have been hard for him to come home every night. She thought about it. At that time, he could be considered to have restrained himself. She didn't know if it was because he wasn't interested in her body or because he was having too much fun in the company. As if sensing her thoughts, Zhou Chongguang pinched her little face and said unhappily, "Do you think I have such a good appetite for just anyone?" Qin Mu was still lying in the bathtub. Looking at his handsome appearance, she suddenly said faintly, "Zhou Chongguang, how can sex go on without love? What about you?" His fingers rubbed her little face gently and he said faintly, "Then what did you think when I hugged you?" "Endure." Qin Mu looked up and said bluntly. In the end, Zhou Chongguang reached out and pinched her little face. "You really dare to say it? Since Mr. Zhou dares to do it, why wouldn't I dare to say it?" Qin Mu retorted. He laughed softly. "It's my fault." Chapter 2398. Qin Mu hugged him softly. "Zhou Chongguang, what else can you do besides threatening me?" "A lot." He said maliciously, "Don't worry, Mrs. Zhou. I'll make it come true for you in the future." Qin Mu bit his neck and then ignored him. When she couldn't see him, his eyes were deep but gentle. He put her under the quilt and carefully hugged her to sleep. As long as he thought of Qin Chen's words, he didn't dare to let her feel any coldness. They lay under the quilt together, and he put her feet in his arms to keep her warm. Qin Mu couldn't fall asleep. She opened her eyes and said, "I'm hot." "Oh," he said softly, and then loosened his grip a little. In his arms, Qin Mu opened one of her eyes and looked at him. "Zhou Chongguang, did you do something to let me down, huh?" He couldn't help laughing. Of course not. Qin Mu snorted. You're unaccountably solicitous, so you must have ulterior motives. He couldn't help laughing and pinched her little face. Even if it's an adulterous eye, it's between us. It's not someone else's business. Qin Mu closed her eyes and said in a low voice, "Don't hug me too tightly, or I won't be able to sleep." Zhou Chongwang looked at her calm little face and sighed in his heart. "Mu, but I want to hug you." She was so tired that she fell asleep, but Zhou Chongwang didn't feel sleepy at all. Later, when she fell asleep, he quietly got out of bed and went outside to smoke 2 cigarettes. He was a little annoyed. Since Qin Chen had come to him so cautiously without letting Qin Mu know, the problem must be serious. His heart was heavy as he stood alone in the dark night. He even regretted asking her to have a child. If he had known earlier, he would have told her that he didn't like children. He only liked the 2 of them. A child was very annoying. However, there was no use in regretting. Now that their relationship was good, Qin Mu was also looking forward to the birth of a child. She liked to let her imagination run wild, and he did not dare to take any risks. Zhou Chongwang smoked 2 cigarettes outside and went back to the bedroom to lie beside her. Qin Mu probably felt cold on his body, so she avoided him and didn't want to be in his arms. He quietly lay down on the side, waiting for his body to warm up before pulling her into his embrace. Qin Mu lay obediently in his arms. She was very obedient, which was the best he had ever seen. Zhou Chongwang leaned over and pressed his warm thin lips against her forehead. He said in a very low voice, "Mu, we will go on together." She had fallen asleep, but she must have found him annoying. Her little hand slapped his handsome face. Zhou Chongwang couldn't help laughing, feeling a little helpless. He kissed her again unwillingly, but his heart was as gentle as water. A child was not so important to him. It might be more important to his mother, but he would persuade her. If it didn't work, he would adopt one. If the Zhou family had to have an heir. That night, Zhou Chongwang couldn't sleep at all. At this moment, he realized that if he loved a woman, he had to be completely devoted to her. Anything that came to him, he had to think about her and make her happy. If she was even a little unhappy, he would not be able to stand it. It turned out that love and affection were like this. Chapter 2399. She stretched out her little hand and played with it. It was a little prickly, but it was also a little fun, so she moved her little hand around. At first, Zhou Chongwang also played along with her. Later on, he was probably provoked and lowered his voice. "Stop it. If you keep playing, I'll fuck you." Qin Mu raised her little face and looked at him eagerly. After a while, she retracted her little hand and said, "Do you still have strength?" Zhou Chongwang held her little body in his arms and lowered his voice. "Do you want to try, Mrs. Zhou?" Qin Mu leaned on his shoulder and giggled. "Mr. Zhou, it's you who wants to try." "Yes, I want to try. I want to do it," he said bluntly. She blushed and struggled, but he didn't let her and locked her in his arms. "Ha!" Qin Mu didn't struggle anymore. She simply lay in his arms and said softly, "Don't you need to go to work?" He said in a low voice, "I'm off today. I'll accompany you." Qin Mu bit her lip. "I don't dare to let you accompany me. How about sleeping instead?" He laughed softly, looking like he was up to no good. His little wife gently struggled against him. He smiled happily and pressed her shoulders. "All right, don't make a fuss. Be a good girl and sleep a little longer. I'll make breakfast for you." "That's great." Qin Mu lay down again and covered herself with the quilt, leaving only her eyes open. There was a smile in her eyes. That smile was full of happiness. Zhou Chongguang looked at her and felt touched. If he could, he would let her be happy like this forever. He reached out and rubbed her hair. His voice was a little hoarse. "All right, be good. Sleep well. There are bruises around your eyes." Qin Mu pulled the quilt to cover her little face and said in a muffled voice, "Mr. Zhou, you're the one with dark circles around your eyes. I can tell that you've been overindulging." He was so amused that he couldn't wait to pull her out of the quilt and do it again. But he just smiled, reached out and pinched her little face, then got out of bed to wash his face. As Qin Mu lay down, she could hear the sound of him brushing his teeth in the bathroom, as well as the soft sound of him shaving. He shaved almost every day, and he didn't seem to like having a trace of discomfort on his face. Qin Mu sighed. In fact, he was quite a neat freak. When Zhou Chongguang came out of the changing room, he had already changed his clothes. He was wearing a light gray sweater and dark brown casual pants, looking very comfortable at home. When he passed by the bed, he purposely walked over to push aside her blanket and kissed her little face. Qin Mu covered her face and laughed. He also smiled slightly. "You're getting better at acting coquettishly." Actually, it was quite good. He also liked to spoil her. Zhou Chongguang casually went downstairs and entered the kitchen. The servants were a little surprised. "Let me make Madam's breakfast. You can leave first," he said in a low voice. Then he took out the Chinese medicine that he had prepared last night from the cabinet. He had never done this before, so he asked the servants to help him boil the medicine. "Sir, are you not feeling well?" The servant hesitated and asked, "This medicine is very choking." "Well, Mumu caught a cold." There was a hint of gentleness on Zhou Chongguang's face. "It's for strengthening the body." The servant nodded and was very happy. Mr. Zhou was really good to the young lady now. How many men were willing to boil medicine for their wife early in the morning? Chapter 2400. He raised his hand to check the time. It was already past 9 o'clock, so he took the tray and went upstairs. The second floor was quiet. He pushed open the door of the master bedroom. Qin Mu seemed to be asleep and didn't move. He walked over, put the tray aside, sat by the bed and called her name, "Mu, wake up." Qin Mu turned over and said in a muffled voice, "Zhou Chongguang, I want to sleep for a while more. It's time for breakfast." He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "If you don't get up, I'll have sex." Qin Mu nodded and turned over again. She opened her eyes and glared at him. "Bossy." He took the opportunity to kiss her lips and said, "I got up early in the morning to make breakfast for you, and you said I was bossy, huh?" Qin Mu covered his lips. "I haven't brushed my teeth yet." He also reached out to grab her little hand and said meaningfully, "Qin Mu, you haven't washed your hands." She blushed, snorted and glared at him. Finally, she sat up and watched him move the tray closer. "I haven't washed my hands." She wanted to get out of bed. Zhou Chongguang held her down and said, "Let me feed you." Qin Mu stuck out her tongue. "That's so mushy." However, she was lazy, so she leaned against the bed and let him feed her. They had never been so close before. He had never doted on her like this, and she had never had the face to ask for it before. Only now did she know that Zhou Chongguang could also dote on women. She felt a little complicated, but she still accepted it. She had said that she would give him a chance. After feeding her breakfast, he asked her solemnly, "How does it taste?" "It's okay. There's still room for improvement," she said euphemistically. Zhou Chongguang pinched her little face and smiled. He took the thermos beside him and said, I found a doctor and gave you a prescription. It's to strengthen your body. You always catch colds. Try drinking medicine for 2 to 3 months and see if your body will get better." With that, he opened the bottle and poured himself a glass. Cher immediately felt repulsed by the strong smell of medicine. She pinched her nose and said in a humming voice, "Are you trying to poison me by making breakfast for me?" Zhou Chongguang didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, he really didn't expect that Qin Mu would be so afraid of taking medicine. She had always been indifferent, unlike Tang Cher, who was clingy. But now, it seemed that all girls were the same. He didn't find it annoying. Instead, he liked it. Zhou Chongguang pulled away her little hand and chuckled, "How can I bear to poison you? If I poison you, where can I find another wife? Where can I find such a lovely girl?" Not only did he say that, he even kissed her hand. Qin Mu was a little stunned. She looked at him and said, "Zhou Chongguang, you're the one who said that I haven't washed my hands. I don't despise you." His voice was low and hoarse as he whispered in her ear, "When are you going to serve me as well?" In the past, they didn't have any tricks. But ever since they got back together, in order to please her, Zhou Chongguang felt that he had put in quite a bit of effort. He wasn't afraid of getting dirty or tired. However, Qin Mu was rather conservative and didn't really want to accept that kind of service. And as a man, he naturally wanted to. But, he remembered that she had said that he was dirty and he didn't dare to force her. Chapter 2401. Qin Mu covered her face. "Zhou Chongguang, if I don't have to drink those pills, I'll be willing." Zhou Chongguang's heart skipped a beat. He was ecstatic. He really couldn't believe that she was willing to do that for him. But, however, a man's instinct made him choose to enjoy it first. As for taking the pills, he could coax her slowly. He reached out and held her in his arms. He said in a low voice, "You like me, okay?" Qin Mu was extremely embarrassed. She pinched him hard with her little hand and bit her lip. "Zhou Chongguang, you bastard." However, in order not to drink the pills, she still tried to please him. 10,000 words were omitted. After it was over, Zhou Chongguang lay down. His breathing was messy. He had never been like this before. It was as if all the strength in his body had been drained. He had even cried out in embarrassment just now. Although he tried his best to calm down, he still pressed her into his arms. After a while, he regained some strength and kissed the hair on her forehead. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Moo moo, little fool." Her eyes were still moist. Not only him, but she had also moved her eyes just now. At this moment, she was in a mess. He knew her body so well. How could he not know? After calming down, he pressed his lips against her little ear and said in a low voice, "I'll help you, okay?" Qin Mu closed her eyes and said weakly, "No." However, he had already carried her into the bathroom. Under the warm water, she was pressed against him and he tried his best to please her. And she could only accept it. However, what infuriated Qin Mu the most was that after he enjoyed it, he tormented her until she was on her last breath. In the end, he still hugged her in his arms and fed her the medicine mouth to mouth. The process was indescribable, but it wasn't that painful. After feeding him the pills, Qin Mu lowered her head and bit his chin with a bitter face. Jerk. Zhou Chongguang laughed wantonly. "If you refuse to take the pills next time, I'll teach you a lesson." Qin Mu covered her head with the blanket and ignored him. Zhou Chongguang was about to say something when someone knocked on the door. He paused and straightened his body. "What is it?" A servant stood outside and said respectfully, "Mr. Zhou, the old granny is here." Zhou Chongguang was a little surprised. His mother. Ever since he and Qin Mu got married, his mother had never stepped into this villa because it belonged to the Qin family. Why are you willing to come today? After thinking about it, she whispered to Qin Mu, you sleep a little longer. I'll go downstairs to entertain them. Oh, Qin Mu replied obediently. Should I get up? It's not proper. He pressed her down and smiled. I will explain. Be good and lie down to sleep. Qin Mu was still worried, but she still lay down because she was worried about the hickey on her neck. After all, the old man might not be able to accept it. When Zhou Chongwang left, she glared at him. Don't talk nonsense. He smiled and gently pinched her little face. Got it. A minute later, he slowly went downstairs. His mother was not sitting in the living room. He only saw a cup of tea on the table and the servant standing there with a troubled look. The old granny is in the kitchen. Zhou Chongwang nodded and smiled. Got it. You can leave now. After all, it was not good for the mother and son to talk. Chapter 2402. Mom. Zhou Chongwang walked over and said, why don't you sit in the living room? Mrs. Zhou looked back at him and said, is Qin Mu sick? Why are you cooking this so early in the morning? Zhou Chongwang smiled and said, Qin Mu caught a cold yesterday. She's still asleep now, so she took the medicine. Mrs. Zhou nodded and said, you're really dedicated. How can young people nowadays drink Chinese medicine? Western medicine comes quickly. Hearing his mother's words, Zhou Chongwang smiled and didn't say anything. It was not a good idea for the two of them to stay in the kitchen, so they sat in the living room for a while. Mrs. Zhou raised her voice and asked someone to bring out the tonics she had brought from the car. Finally, she said solemnly, I collected all these things. They're the most beneficial for women. She paused again and then calmed down. In the past, you always played outside, so I wasn't very optimistic about your marriage and didn't urge you to have children. But now you have a good relationship. Chongwang, you'll be 29 after the new year, and you'll be 30 soon. Have a child. It's not bad for you, Dad. Zhou Chongwang was silent for a while before he said with a smile, Mom, Mumu and I have plans. I'm going to have a child when I'm 30, he paused and said, Mumu is still young. Recently, she wants to open a studio, and I'm also very supportive. So, let's wait another 2 years. Mrs. Zhou looked at him and said, you're too indulgent with her now. Zhou Chongwang just smiled, picked up the tea at hand and took a sip. Of course not. She usually listens to me. I'm very strict with her. Although he said that, Mrs. Zhou couldn't see the affection in her son's eyes. She sighed in her heart, maybe this ending is better. She got up and said, I won't stay for dinner, lest your wife feels uncomfortable. No. Zhou Chongwang deliberately tried to please his mother. Qin Mu is still looking forward to you coming. Come on. Mrs. Zhou glanced at her son and said, now that your business is big, your ability to lie with your eyes open has also improved a lot. She paused and then continued, how can I not know that I'm an annoying old woman? No. Zhou Chongwang chuckled. Well, I'll see you out. Mrs. Zhou was angry and amused. I knew you were an ingrate. You forgot your mother after you got married. Zhou Chongwang didn't deny it. In fact, he felt that they hadn't had such a relaxed chat since 8 years ago. After Mrs. Zhou left, Chongwang went back to the living room and looked at the pile of tonics. He didn't want to let Qin Mu know and put more pressure on her. Thus, after some thought, he got the servants to move it into the cabinet in the kitchen. He calmly ordered, don't let Madam know. The Zhou Chang's Zhou and then he. When he went upstairs, to his surprise, Qin Mu didn't fall asleep. Instead, she leaned against the bed and watched him come in. "Is your mother gone?" When he reached upstairs, Qin Mu surprisingly wasn't asleep. Instead, he leaned against the headboard and watched him enter. He asked calmly, "Your mother left?" Qin Mu said in a soft voice. "Why didn't you save lunch? Zhou Zong can cook by himself." He saw her naughtiness, smiled, and reached out to pinch her little face. "Well, only Mumu can enjoy my personal service." He saw her naughtiness, smiled, and pinched her little face. "Well, only Mumu can enjoy my personal service." His words had a double meaning. Qin Mu blushed and glared at him. "You're not serious." Chapter 2403. Zhou Chongwang smiled and didn't say anything else. He just leaned against the head of the bed and gently patted her to coax her to sleep. When Qin Mu woke up, it was already afternoon. Opening her eyes, Zhou Chongwang carried her to the bathroom. "Your brother just called and asked us to go to your parents' house for dinner." He put Qin Mu in the bathroom and brushed her teeth in a daze. Half of it was done by herself, and the other half was done by him. Later, Qin Mu simply stopped moving and let him serve her. Zhou Chongwang reached out and knocked her on the head. He scolded her with a smile, "What a villain." It was rare for Qin Mu to act coquettishly. "Do you like it?" Zhou Chongwang looked down at her with hot eyes. After looking at her for a long time, he finally lowered his head and said in a trembling voice, "Of course I like it." He liked her so much that he was already a little worried about losing her. Sometimes, he would even dream that Mumu would say that he was dirty and that she was going to leave him. How could he bear to do that? Zhou Chongwang's throat was a little tight, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Mrs. Zhou, you're seducing me." "No, it's Mr. Zhou who can't control his unreasonable desire." Qin Mu snorted and pushed him. "Carry me to the dressing room." He couldn't help laughing. She was now very good at using him. Probably because of her mood, she chose a light pink coat that she had rarely worn before. Zhou Chongwang couldn't help looking at it for a long time before he remembered that his little wife was actually only 22 years old. In the past, she had deliberately dressed in a mature way. "You look like a little girl." He reached out and pinched her face. "Don't provoke people outside." Qin Mu said very slowly, "That's what I want to say to you, Mr. Zhou." Zhou Chongwang laughed, put his arm around her shoulder, and wrapped a thick scarf around her. When he walked out, it was snowing lightly outside. Qin Mu couldn't help but turn around and look at him with a cheerful expression. "Zhou Chongwang, it's snowing." As she spoke, she breathed out hot air. Then, she breathed into his car and wrote 2 words. Zhou Chongwang glanced at her and snorted softly, "Qin Mu, if you really dare to make me a turtle, I'll break your legs." "How can I walk without legs?" Qin Mu's voice was soft. When he opened the car door, she leaned behind him. "Then you'll have to carry me for the rest of your life." Zhou Chongwang did not retract his hand from the car door. He paused for a moment and laughed. "Well, then I'm a snail. I have a shell on my back." Qin Mu hugged him and whispered in his ear, "A tortoise also carries its shell." Zhou Chongwang's heart was boiling hot. When Qin Mu was naughty, it was terrible. He suddenly turned around and held her little face with both hands. He turned around and pressed her against the car, kissing her little mouth. His kiss was a little rough, and Qin Mu was not only a little uncomfortable, but also a little shy. Now that they were outside, there would be servants coming over at any time. She struggled and said in a muffled voice, "Zhou Chongwang, but the more she struggled, the more fiercely he kissed her, almost roughly pressing her against the car, pressing her so hard that her bones hurt. Qin Mu bit her lip and endured his rough kiss. Although he was a carnivore, he rarely indulged himself like this outside. Qin Mu struggled for a while, but she had no strength left, so she let him kiss her. Chapter 2404. She bit his lips angrily. Someone will see it. He chuckled and licked his lips, looking as if he hadn't had enough. Then let them see. Shameless. Qin Mu turned around and wanted to get in the car, but he hugged her from behind and whispered behind her ear, "You're shy, huh?" Qin Mu bit her lips, and there were tears in her eyes. "Zhou Chongguang, I'm not used to being outside." He chuckled, and his warm breath brushed against her ear, causing her to shiver. "Okay, next time in the bedroom, huh?" he said in a low voice and bit her ear again. Watching her scream made him feel especially happy. In the end, he opened the car door for her and helped her into the car. When they arrived at the Qin family, they found that not only Yi Muyun, Cher, and Xiao Yishu, but also Qin Mo and Qin Chen were back. It was a family gathering. In the past, Zhou Chongguang would never attend such gatherings. He was always separated from the Qin family. Even now, he still wasn't free. But since he had decided to love Qin Mu, he had to accept everything. Fortunately, he bought Xiao Yishu's gift on the way, so it wasn't rude. However, when Zhou Chongguang saw Xiao Yishu wearing a woolen suit and following the cool Qin Chen, he sighed. It was really a common hobby of the family. It definitely had nothing to do with Lan Yu's education. Lan Yu was the scapegoat. He even sympathized with Lan Yu. It wouldn't be easy for him to fall into the hands of Qin Chen, who was half man and half woman. Just thinking about it, Zhou Zong felt that his life was still perfect. He gave a set of launching excavator to Xiao Yishu, and she was very happy. When he looked up, he saw Yi Muyun's dark face, so he smiled happily. "Yishu, Uncle will buy you a whole set of small trains and planes in the future." Mr. Ye's face became darker. And Zhou Chongguang coughed and said to his little wife, "If we have children in the future, especially girls, don't be with Qin Chen. It was too dangerous. He could become a monster like Qin Chen at any time." Qin Mu carefully looked at her brother, and then looked at Qin Chen. She swallowed hard. When Xiao Yishu grew up, would she be like Qin Chen, who liked to act cool and let a bunch of nurses scream at her? Just thinking about it, she knew that her brother would have a headache in the future. Qin Mu didn't dare to say anything. She had always been a little afraid of Yi Muyun, but Zhou Chongguang wasn't afraid. Moreover, the two of them had some grudges. Fortunately, there was a child, so the atmosphere was harmonious. But when they were discussing the wedding date of Yi Muyun and Cher, the little fellow's little face fell, indicating that she wasn't happy. She had slept with Yi Sansan for so many days, and it turned out that she had been tricked. Yi Sansan had never given up on her mother. Xiao Yishu wasn't interested in the toy anymore, so she threw it aside. The little fellow was very disappointed. Her mother was going to marry Yi Sansan, and she could no longer be with her parents. The little boy sat alone in the yard, hugging himself. Qin Mu looked at him, walked over quietly, and sat there like Xiao Yishu. She tilted her head and smiled. "What's wrong, Yishu?" Xiao Yishu looked up and looked at Qin Mu, and Chapter 2405. The little girl lowered her head again. After a while, she said softly, "But I can't bear to part with Lan Yu, Daddy." As she spoke, the little girl's pee dripped down. She looked very pitiful. Qin Mu's heart softened. She held Xiao Yishu in her arms and kissed her fair forehead. It really felt like a milk bun, fragrant and soft. No wonder her brother had a crush on Cher when he was young. This touch was really different. Were all children so cute? Chin Mu's heart softened. Ishu actually likes Yi Sansan too, right? The little girl didn't say anything and lowered her head. It wasn't that she didn't like him, but that she didn't want to admit it. It was because she liked him so much that she felt that it would be strange for Yi Sansan to be a father. Besides, Xiao Ishu already had a father. The little girl didn't say anything. Chin Mu smiled. She knew what she was thinking and reached out to rub her head. In the future, Wan Yu can also be Ishu's father, do you know? Ishu can have another father. Think about it, isn't it a good deal? Xiao Ishu looked up innocently. Really? However, she soon looked hesitant. Then which father will mommy belong to? Chin Mu was stumped. It was difficult for her to answer this question for a while. At this time, Zhou Chongguang sat next to her and smiled. It depends on your mother's choice. Xiao Ishu cried. Mommy will definitely choose Yi Sansan. Because her mother and Yi Sansan often kissed, she didn't do it with her father before. Seeing her cry like this, Chin Mu and Zhou Chongguang both laughed. They didn't want to comfort the little girl anymore. They just felt that the little girl was really too cute. Lon Error stole a glance. These two actually didn't comfort her. Wow, she was too pitiful. Wow, she wanted a father. Lon Error tossed and turned for a long time. In the end, it was Zhou Chongguang who picked her up and coaxed her. Chin Mu looked at the way he spoke softly and smiled. She got up and hugged one of his arms. In a very soft voice, she said, Zhou Chongguang, do you like children very much? Zhou Chongguang tilted his head and thought for a moment before saying, Xiao Ishu is quite cute like this. Chin Mu wrinkled her nose and looked around to make sure no one was around. She lowered her voice and said, Is it because Ishu is Cher's daughter that you like her so much? What are you thinking about? He laughed and pinched her face with one hand. If you were the one who gave birth to her, I would like it even more. After saying that, he felt a little regretful, and he sighed inwardly. He didn't want to see Chin Mu disappointed one day. He was even ready to have a vasectomy and tell everyone that there was something wrong with him if Mumu couldn't give birth. He had thousands of thoughts in his mind, but Chin Mu didn't know. She bit his arm and said, I won't give birth. After that, she ran away. Zhou Chongguang looked at the little girl in his hand and said helplessly, Look, women are troublesome. Xiao Ishu's eyes were full of tears. She looked at him and then burst into tears again. Others say that I'm a girl. Uncle, you say that Xiao Ishu is troublesome. The little girl cried sadly. She felt that there was really no one in the world who didn't love her. The whole world was full of malice. Zhou Chongguang was stunned. He was defeated by the little girl. Do you like children very much? A cold voice sounded in his ear. Chapter 2406. As soon as he looked up, he saw Chin Chin leaning against the side with a blade of grass in his mouth. He was still dressed as a man. He was so handsome. To be honest, he was not feminine at all when he was a man. He was really beautiful. However, what troubled Zhou Chongguang was that Chin Chin did not have the gentleness of a young girl, and he was cunning that men did not have. His eyes, just take Chin Chin as written by a man, often seemed to be mocking Zhou Chongguang, as if he could see through everything. Zhou Chongguang was often embarrassed by his gaze. He thought about it carefully before answering Chin Chin. It depends on fate. Chin Chin smiled. You're very cautious. Why are you afraid of me? Zhou Chongguang snorted. That's because you're Qin Mu's younger brother. Is this considered a personal attack? Qin Chen's voice was still lazy and carried a hint of indifference. Zhou Chongguang smiled and said, let's see how you interpret it. There was a hint of appreciation in Qin Chen's beautiful eyes. Okay, you've passed. He left the way he came and took Xiao Yishu away. This child was quite cute. Her whole body smelled like milk buns, and she was raised by that pervert, Lan Yu. However, she was cute and stupid. He quite liked her. The author really likes the character Qin Chen. Please don't stop the author from writing about him. I'm so fascinated. Zhou Chongguang narrowed his eyes. A woman who was more handsome than a man. And she was Qin Mu's compatriot. Fortunately, his Mumu was not like this. Otherwise, Zhou Chongguang could not imagine how he could hug a good-looking man and have sex. He was sure that Qin Chen must be in airport. Looking at his thin body and his long and straight legs, it was not out of place to dress up as a man. No, she was not pretending to be a man. He was a man. Zhou Chongguang looked at him for a long time and smiled. Qin Chen took the little milk buns and played with them for a long time. When the party was over, he returned them to Yi Muyun. When Xiao Yishu left, she waved at Qin Chen reluctantly. Goodbye, uncle. Cher covered her face. Qin Chen smiled faintly. Goodbye, little brother. Shuer sneaked a peek at Yi Muyun and noticed that the muscles at the corner of his mouth were twitching slightly. She thought about it. One was his younger brother, no, his younger sister, and the other was his son, not his daughter. All of them were like this. No wonder he had a headache. At this time, Cher still felt sorry for him and forgot that she was actually Xiao Yishu's mother. On the way back, Cher sat in the passenger seat and looked at Yi Muyun from time to time. He reached out and held her fingertips. Why do you keep peeking at me, huh? Of course not. She blurted out. Yi Muyun smiled and did not expose her. In fact, he knew what she was thinking. In fact, Qin Chen's dressing and style of doing things were no longer a problem for him. The entire Qin family was up to him. After all, he was already an adult and knew what he wanted. Moreover, he had been independent since he was a child and had never suffered losses. But Yishu was different. She was still young and had not established her values. She was also soft-hearted, very much like Cher. A male version of Cher. He didn't dare to think about it. But his little wife was not worried at all and was still watching him make a fool of himself. Chapter 2407. Xiao Yishu, who was sitting in the back seat, had been secretly observing them. She knew that their marriage was almost set in stone. The little girl was half lying down, and her little face was full of disappointment. Yi Muyun also saw it from the rearview mirror, and he couldn't help smiling. His child was so cute whether she was dissatisfied with him or angry with him. He just looked at her, and then focused on driving. It was a snowy night, and the road was a little slippery. He slowed down the car. Cher didn't talk to him anymore, for fear that she might affect his driving. Under the streetlights, the fine snow was falling, so clear that it could be seen. The road was already covered with a thin layer of white. Yi Muyun drove a little slower, and his handsome face flickered under the passing headlights. At a crossroad in front of them, a truck suddenly slanted in their direction. The slippery road made the speed of the truck even faster, but it was also more dangerous. Yi Muyun braked, and the car screeched, but still rushed forward at a very slow speed. The truck was getting closer and closer. He quickly held the steering wheel with his slender hands, and began to reverse the car. He reversed very fast, and then drove forward toward the roadside. With a bang, the front of the car hit a wire pole. The front of the car was smoking. And the truck brushed past his car, and finally turned over on the roadside with a bang. Yi Muyun leaned on the steering wheel, and when he came to his senses, he turned his head. Cher also came to her senses, and realized that there was a lot of blood on his forehead, and blood kept dripping from his arm. She covered her little mouth. "I'm fine," he said calmly, and quickly straightened his seat, and stepped to the back seat to pick up his little girl. Although Xiao Yishu sat in the child's seat, she still hurt her legs, and blood kept oozing from her pants. Yi Muyun couldn't care about anything else, and while unfastening the little girl's seatbelt, he ordered Cher, "Call Qin Chen, and ask him to arrange an ambulance to come here. We can give blood in the ambulance." Although Cher was worried about him, she was more willing to listen to him at this time. In such a cold, dark, and helpless night, he was injured, but he could still give her a sense of security. She was even more clear that he had hit himself like this in order to protect her and Ishu. She was afraid of blood, but she could not faint now. He and Ishu both needed her. Cher's hands trembled as she pursed her lips. Resolutely, she dialed Qin Chen's number and briefly explained the situation. Then, she looked at the roadside sign that indicated the location. Qin Chen informed the hospital and quickly drove over. Yi Muyun's blood continued to flow. He had lost a lot of blood, and it was a ghastly sight. Although Xiao Yishu's wound wasn't big, it was still bleeding profusely. On such a snowy night, it was truly despairing. However, Cher was braver than ever before. She took out a few towels from the car and bandaged them up carefully. However, the blood on Yi Muyun's arm continued to drip down continuously. Looking at it drop by drop, it looked terrifying. "Brother." Finally, Cher couldn't help sobbing. His voice comforted her gently. "Be good, I'm fine." He held Xiao Yishu in his arms. He was afraid that she would be scared, so he kept coaxing her. It was just like how he coaxed her when she was young. Cher's eyes were filled with tears. Now she finally understood what his feelings for her were like from the past to the present. Chapter 2408. He gave the only woolen blanket to Ishu and wrapped her up in it. The child's body was weak and she could not catch a cold. Otherwise, she would definitely have a fever. Not only that, he even used his own body heat to warm her up. He took off the sweater and used the warmest part of his chest to warm her up. Xiao Yishu felt dizzy and uncomfortable. She felt that she was being held in a warm embrace. It was a very warm embrace, just like her father's. She called out softly. Yi Muyun's voice was deep. "Daddy's here." Xiao Yishu struggled to open her eyes and looked up at that handsome face in the dark. There was a lot of blood and it was blurry. But she could tell that it was Yi Sansan. Yi Sansan had bled a lot, but why was he still hugging her so tightly? Xiao Yishu closed her eyes tiredly. She lowered her head in Yi Muyun's embrace and mumbled for a long time. Her little fingers secretly hugged his waist and she breathed out weakly. "Uncle, am I going to die?" "Nonsense, how can that be? I will always watch over our Xiao Yishu." Yi Muyun shook his head. His vision was blurry but he had to hold on. He had to give Ishu a blood transfusion. Also, Cher would be afraid if he fainted. He forced himself to talk to little Ishu. He did not let her sleep, nor did he let her be afraid. The blood on his arm continued to flow. It was so much that Xiao Yishu was afraid. She finally cried out softly. "Uncle, are you going to die?" He let out a long sigh. No. But he knew that if the ambulance did not arrive soon, he might bleed to death. Cher was on the verge of tears. But she did not dare to cry. She could only press on his wound tightly so that his blood would not flow so quickly. She tried her best to suppress her emotions, afraid that she would cry and upset him. In such a dark, icy night, their hearts were once again together. And this time, there was their child. Qin Chen and the ambulance arrived at almost the same time. As soon as his car stopped, he opened the door and jumped out. He immediately opened the back door and carefully carried Ishu out. He then asked in a low voice, "Brother, can you still walk? Help me up, Cher." Yi Muyun's voice was a bit weak as he spoke in a low and hoarse voice. Cher replied with an "oh" and helped him out of the car with tears streaming down her face. Then, she got into the ambulance with great difficulty. Qin Chen was already preparing the blood bag. He looked at Yi Muyun and asked, "Can you hold on?" Because Xiao Yishu could not be delayed. Yi Muyun clenched his teeth. Drawl. Qin Chen looked at him quietly and quickly began to draw blood. After inserting the needle, he started to help him stop the bleeding. His actions were so swift that it made people's hair stand on end. There was not a single trace of emotion in his actions. Cher gulped. She was worried about Yi Muyun and Xiao Yishu. Qin Chen's technique was very good. Very soon, Yi Muyun's bleeding had stopped. But he was still drawing blood. After drawing about 300 milliliters of blood, his face turned pale. Qin Chen's voice was very calm. "Can you still hold on?" Yi Muyun smiled faintly. "Yes." Cher's fingers were twisted together as she looked at him uneasily. As for Qin Chen, he cruelly changed another blood bag and gave the blood he drew to Xiao Yishu. Yi Muyun's face was getting paler and paler. He had drawn 2 full bags of blood. Chapter 2409. Actually, the amount of blood Xiao Yishu needed was not enough, but the 600 milliliters were enough for them to reach the hospital. Needless to say, Yi Muyun could not hold on any longer. He was in shock. "Put him on a drip." Qin Chen ordered the nurse expressionlessly while he took care of Xiao Yishu. His brother's body should be able to take it, but Xiao Yishu needed careful care. Cher stayed by Yi Muyun's side because Xiao Yishu had Qin Chen by her side. Although Qin Chen had always been cool, she trusted him, very much. She looked at Yi Muyun, bit her lip and asked Qin Chen, Will he be alright?" "Probably. He won't die." Qin Chen winked at her. "Don't worry, I'll keep him alive so that you can get married." Cher pursed her lips and did not say a word. She kept holding his hand, hoping that he would suddenly wake up. But that night, Yi Muyun did not wake up. The ambulance arrived at Xingyuan Hospital an hour later. Qin Chen arranged a ward for him. He did not want to sleep tonight because Xiao Yishu's bleeding had not stopped. Yi Muyun could not draw any more for the time being. If he did, he might die. It was a snowy night, and Xingyuan Hospital was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. But the emergency room was still brightly lit. Yi Muyun was still unconscious, and he had a fever of 39.5 degrees Celsius. Qin Chen forcefully put him on an 4 drip. He did not have time to care about him. He took a blood bag and brought a nurse to the VIP ward on the top floor. The door opened, and Lan Yu was lying quietly. Although it was late, he was not asleep. At that moment, the lights in the ward suddenly turned on, and it was very dazzling. Lan Ding opened his eyes and stared at the person who suddenly appeared. It was that black-hearted quack again, and he even had a needle in his hand. "What are you doing here again?" Lan Yu's expression was a little guarded. Qin Chen didn't have time to put on his white coat. He was wearing a thin woolen coat, which made his cold face look good and beautiful. This was also the first time that Lan Yu had seen this sissy wearing casual clothes. Lan Yu was a little reluctant to admit that this sissy had a very good innate condition. Although he was only about 175 centimeters tall, his aura was no weaker than a man who was more than 180 centimeters tall. However, no matter how good-looking this quack was, it couldn't change the fact that he had done evil. Lan Yu glared at him. Qin Chen walked over quickly with his long limbs. Your blood. I've just tested it. It's a special blood type. Although your body is incomplete now, I don't want to use your blood if there's a way. After that, he asked the nurse to press him down, and he rolled up Lan Yu's sleeves. That aura was like a king forcing himself on a bow. The bright red blood flowed into the blood bag like a column, but the speed was a little slow. After all, Lan Yu had just turned from a vegetable to a normal person. Qin Chen also knew that his body was not suitable for drawing blood at this moment. What he did was no different from a robber, and it was against his professional ethics. But at this moment, he couldn't care less. Lan Yu was restrained by a nurse, and the quack in front of him was doing whatever he wanted to him. He almost cursed. For 30 years, Lan Yu was sure that he had never seen such a shameless doctor. This was simply drawing his blood now, and with a face full of disdain, he said that the quality of his blood was not good. Fuck you. Chapter 24:10. Lan Yu was stunned. Then he gritted his teeth. Where's Yimuyun? Where's her father? Although he asked this, he didn't struggle anymore. Qin Chen's eyes fell on the blood vessels. The speed was getting slower and slower. He looked at Lan Yu's skinny body and almost thought that he had drained him dry. Qin Chen decisively pulled out the needle and looked at the blood bag. It was about 150 milliliters. Although it wasn't much, it was better than nothing. He lowered his head and looked at Lan Yu's pale and thin face. He said softly, Yimuyun lost too much blood and is now in a coma. I just drained another 600 milliliters. He paused for a moment and said in a lighter tone, if Ishu needs it, he has to continue draining because he's her father. Qin Chen knew that for the little fellow, Yimuyun would be willing to give up his life. For his own child, he would be willing to do anything. As he said this, Lan Yu closed his eyes. Drain me. Until I'm dry. Since he was already like this, he was willing to give Ishu the best, a father who loved her dearly and a complete family. Qin Chen put away the blood bag and looked at the man on the bed in surprise. He pursed his thin lips and said coldly, I will when necessary. He walked very fast. When his hand was on the doorknob, Lan Yu stopped him. I want to see the child. Qin Chen answered quickly, let's do it at dawn. After that, he didn't leave. When he connected Lan Yu's blood to Ishu's bleeding stopped. He cursed in his heart. Damn, the blood of this vegetable was really useful. Xiao Ishu calmed down a little. Qin Chen asked the nurse to take care of her and went to see his brother. Yimuyun's fever had not subsided, and his whole body was covered in sweat. Cher was trying her best to help him cool down. Qin Chen took the towel from her hand and said mildly, let me do it. Cher looked at him eagerly. Qin Chen's movements were very professional, and he quickly completed the cooling process. After that, he looked at Cher. Take a nap first. Cher shook her head. I'm not sleeping. Qin Chen looked at her for a while and smiled. Okay, you look after my brother. I'll take care of Ishu. In fact, it could be seen even in a consultation room. Although the situation was stable now, no one was in the mood to sleep. They felt that they would only feel at ease when the sun rose. For the time being, he didn't dare to let his family know about this, for fear that they would be worried. The snowy night was especially long. Cher supported herself and stayed up the whole night for the first time. Sometimes, she could see the thick night through the window when she turned her head. After 2 seconds, she turned back to look at Yi Muyun and Xiao Yishu. Qin Chen patted her shoulder and handed her a cup of hot coffee. "It'll be fine." Cher took it and held it in her palm. After a while, she suddenly remembered something. "Where did you go just now?" Qin Chen smiled and coughed. "I went to Lan Yu's ward to get his blood drawn." Cher was a little speechless. Lan Yu was already in such a state, and Qin Chen still had the heart to do it. "Ishu's problem is quite tricky. If you and my brother have a way, let's have another child." "That's how Qin Mo was born to me," Qin Chen said straightforwardly. Cher lowered her head and made a sound of acknowledgement, not rebuking him. After a while, she looked up. "How is Lan Yu?" "He won't die." Qin Chen smiled. "Go and see him in the morning." Chapter 24:11. Is there a difference? Regardless of whether he's willing or not, I'll still do it. Qin Chen smiled wickedly. Of course, he can sue me, but he won't have any evidence. This was the first time Cher had met someone like Qin Chen, a girl. She couldn't take it. No, she wasn't a girl at all. He was a domineering man. On this point, she and Zhou Chongguang had reached an agreement. Qin Chen smiled again and put down the coffee in his hand. He looked at Cher and said, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. I won't joke around with his life unless he's willing." Usually, he wouldn't explain anything to others. If others misunderstood, then so be it. However, Cher was his brother's most important woman and also his sister-in-law. Hence, he was willing to say a few more words. Cher was a little embarrassed by his gaze. Her little heart was pounding. Gosh, this was the first time she was embarrassed by someone of the same gender. She pursed her lips. "Do you intend to be like this forever?" Qin Chen looked at her seriously. "Do you want to be a man?" Cher didn't say anything. It was a tacit agreement. Qin Chen pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "In my heart, there's no gender distinction. Do you understand?" Cher looked at him for a long time and stammered, "Then do you like men or women?" She was thinking that Qin Chen probably liked girls. However, Qin Chen smiled. "I don't know yet. Maybe I like both." Cher was speechless. They couldn't continue the conversation. However, as they chatted, the sky was about to turn bright. There was a hint of white in the sky. Qin Chen got up. "I'll go check on them." Cher grunted in acknowledgement. Finally, after a night, both father and daughter were fine. Yi Muyun woke up at 7 in the morning. His body was still weak. Xiao Yishu woke up at 8 and complained of dizziness the moment she woke up. Too much blood loss. Qin Chen said indifferently, "I can only slowly replenish it." He looked at Yi Muyun and said, "Can you smoke a little more? Yishu will hurt her brain." When he spoke, Xiao Yishu looked at him with tears rolling down her cheeks. "Xiao Yishu, don't hurt your brain. Will Yishu become a fool?" The little guy was crying sadly, weak and sad. His appearance really made people feel sorry for him. "Draw another 200. Yi Muyun walked over and rubbed the little guy's head. "Uncle Qin is lying to you." Xiao Yishu blinked her teary eyes, still looking extremely sad. Meanwhile, the cold-blooded quack had already prepared a blood bag and was about to draw her brother's blood like a blood-sucking demon king. Cher's heart ached to the point of death, but it was useless even if she did. Moreover, Yi Muyun insisted on drawing her brother's blood. Qin Chen didn't show any mercy. He calmly drew his brother's blood. The little guy blinked his big eyes and looked at him. There were tears in the corner of his eyes, but he forgot to cry. His little face was especially lovable. Yi Muyun's face became paler and paler. He sat there and his body was trembling slightly. Xiao Yishu's little hand gently tugged at Qin Chen's sleeve. She asked tearfully, "Will Yi Sansan die?" Qin Chen smiled faintly. "You can't say for sure." Little Lon Error immediately burst into tears. "I don't want Yi Sansan to die, then are you willing to become a little fool?" Qin Chen asked coldly. Chapter 24:12. In other words, you'd rather be a little fool than let Yi Sansan die, right? Qin Chen said coldly. The little fellow was no match for him. She cried and nodded. Wah, wah, wah. I don't want Yi Sansan to die. Qin Chen shrugged and threw Yi Muyun a mocking look. Pfft. How could such a little fool manage Boyi when he couldn't even deal with her? Yi Muyun couldn't care less about that. He only cared about his little milk boy. Xiao Yishu stumbled into his arms and cried loudly. Daddy, I don't want you to die. Sob, sob, sob. The little fool cried loudly in his arms. He hugged the little fellow, feeling both sad and sweet. This was a completely different experience from hugging Cher. After all, the little one in his arms was his own flesh and blood. Yi Muyun gently inhaled the little fellow's scent. There was a hint of pain on his handsome face. It was like regaining something that was lost and getting what he wanted. It wasn't an exaggeration to describe it with all sorts of words. At this moment, he almost forgot that he was drawing blood. His strength was slowly weakening, and he could barely carry Xiao Yishu. The new nanny father fainted in embarrassment again. Amidst Yishu's earth-shattering cries, Qin Chen asked the nurse for an intravenous drip. He said in disgust, "How can you give Shui happiness with this broken body?" Cher's expression was similar to Xiao Yishu's. She wanted to cry but didn't dare to. Hearing Qin Chen's words, she raised her little paw. "Your brother is fine." Qin Chen was stunned for a moment, then he chuckled softly. Shui was such a treasure, she was so dumb that she was adorably cute. He reached out to pick up Xiao Yishu and pressed her little body on the bed. He said with rare gentleness, "Be good. Yi Sansan won't die if you don't cry. Also, call him daddy and he'll live a long life." "You're lying to me." Little friend Lon Error's eyes were brimming with tears. After a long time, he finally spoke. Qin Chen narrowed his eyes and smiled. "At least you're not too stupid." As he spoke, he glanced at Shui. Shui hung her head low. At the entrance of the emergency department, Lan Yu sat in his wheelchair and watched silently. She watched as Yi Muyun fainted, watched as Yishu cried for her father, and watched as Cher guarded Yi Muyun like a wife. Everything was so perfect, and there was no place for him to stand. He had completely lost. It started with hatred and ended with his heart beating fast. Lan Yu's thin face trembled violently. He smiled bitterly and raised his hand to signal the nurse beside him. "Let's go back to the ward." The nurse looked at him sympathetically. Sigh, Mr. Blue's expression looked as if he had been made a cuckold. Previously, when he returned to the country, he was quite high profile, showing off his wife and children. So, none of them belonged to him. The nurse sighed. Mr. Lan was really unlucky. When he was sick, he fell into the hands of Dr. Qin. Dr. Chin was kind to female patients, but when it came to male patients, it was infuriating. The nurse nodded and silently prepared to push Lan Yu back to the ward. However, the moment he left, Qin Chen noticed him and looked up. Qin Chen did not alarm anyone. She just looked at Lan Yu quietly. Looking at the disillusionment in his eyes, Lan Yu left in a sorry state. The nurse pushed him, and he pushed the wheel. His hand was almost crushed. Qin Chen only looked at him for a few seconds before she lowered her eyes and continued to transfuse blood into Xiao Yishu. However, the corner of her mouth curved up slightly, revealing a faint smile. Chapter 24:13. Xiao Yishu blinked her big teary eyes. Won't Yi Sansan die? You have to call him Daddy. Qin Chen smiled and reached out to rub the little girl. Xiao Yishu's gaze fell on Yi Muyan again. She pursed her lips, feeling a little embarrassed. Qin Chen didn't force her. He hung up the little girl and asked the nurse to buy some breakfast. His voice was very gentle when he instructed the nurse, and the nurse blushed. Cher looked at him eagerly. She felt that Qin Chen was too immersed in his role and seemed to be enjoying a woman's adoration. Qin Chen knew that she was looking at him. He only smiled. His faint smile was so beautiful that it could make one scream. Even Cher felt that she was about to fall under Qin Chen's casual pants. This world was too fantastical. She immediately looked away from Qin Chen, but Qin Chen winked at her. It was like a brother-in-law seducing his sister-in-law. Cher felt that if she were to become gay one day, the person she would become gay with would be Qin Chen. Would Yi Muyun beat her to death then? She felt that it was highly possible. Qin Chen looked at Yi Muyun again. Then he put his hand in his pocket and said mildly, I'm going to the office to change. You sleep for a while. They're fine. Cher nodded and then lay down beside Xiao Yishu carefully. She was indeed very tired. Qin Chen looked at her, and with a gentle expression, he left with light steps. He walked back to the office and took off his coat. It was a light brown sweater with a dark blue checkered shirt inside. It was a perfect match, and he wore a pair of dark-colored casual pants. He threw his coat casually on the back of the sofa and went to the water dispenser to pour himself a glass of water. His full-time nurse secretary stood beside him, reporting his work today with a blushing face. Qin Chen listened a little absent-mindedly. After the nurse finished speaking, he poured some water and said calmly, I remember there was a surgery at 4 in the afternoon. The nurse paused for a moment and then said apologetically, that patient passed away last night. Qin Chen's hand that was in the middle of drinking water paused. He raised his eyes, and there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. After a while, he said calmly, who's on duty? Can people die in the hospital? The young nurse hesitated for a moment. The patient's family refused to pay the fee at the last minute. So, the patient ran outside, and jumped into the river. Qin Chen glanced at her, and then the nurse was not sure if she had heard it clearly. Did Dr. Qin swear just now? After a brief moment of silence, Qin Chen said softly, got it, you can leave first. The nurse breathed a sigh of relief. She must have been hallucinating just now. How could Dr. Qin swear? She left and even considerately closed the door. Qin Chen was still standing there, holding his thermos flask in his hand. He looked at it for a long time before taking a sip. He drank very slowly. There was a hint of bitterness in the flask, and he tasted it on the tip of his tongue. Every time, when he was helpless, he tasted it. Qin Chen stood in the morning light, letting the faint sunlight shine on his body. It was warm, but it could not warm him up. He was not old, but maybe because he was a surgeon, he felt that his heart was numb sometimes. He had seen too many deaths. At this moment, his heart was empty. He stood by the window, holding a cup of hot tea. He felt that the tea in his hand was the only warmth at this moment. Chapter 24:14. Yi Muyun had already woken up. There was a little guy in his arms as he had wished. At this moment, Mr. Yi was reaching out to stroke the little curly hair. His expression was indescribably loving. Cher was kneeling beside him like a little puppy. Qin Chen stood at the door and watched quietly. What a loving family of three. He watched for a while but didn't go in. He put his hand on his white coat and walked towards the elevator. When he arrived at the VIP ward on the top floor, Qin Chen pushed the door open. Lan Yu had already been moved back to the hospital bed. At this moment, he was lying on his back and seemed to be in a daze. Qin Chen had seen many patients, but he had never seen a patient as passive as Lan Yu. He looked like he didn't care about life and death. He didn't care about everything around him because the things he cared about were gone. Qin Chen had never experienced love. Just as Cher asked, he didn't know whether he liked men or women, but he understood human nature. This was a doctor who had to be compassionate as soon as he entered the profession. But after so many years, he had become so used to hiding it that he almost ignored himself. When Qin Chen came in, the nurse subconsciously said, "Good morning, Dr. Qin." Qin Chen nodded faintly and walked over slowly. He stood at the head of Lan Yu's bed. "How are you today?" Lan Yu's gaze shifted to him. His speed was very slow. Although he was very young, he gave off the feeling that he was about to die. But his eyes instantly had a hint of mockery. "Are you referring to this leg of mine or the other leg?" There was a hint of mockery in Lan Yu's tone. Originally, this kind of mockery was only shown to women, but he said it to this overly beautiful male doctor. After saying it, he felt that he was crazy. Qin Chen didn't care. "I have to examine it to know." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and asked subconsciously, "What do you want to do now?" Qin Chen gave the young nurse a look, and the young nurse immediately brought a medical tray over. He looked at Qin Chen quietly and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't worry, I won't destroy them again." With that, he gently closed his eyes. Qin Chen smiled. "That's great." He looked at the man in front of him and said calmly, "I'm curious what you've been up to all these years." Lan Yu ignored him. His eyes were still closed, as if refusing to communicate with him. Qin Chen didn't say anything. He just smiled faintly and looked at the two nurses. "Get ready, I'm going to help Mr. Lan unblock his blood vessels." Lan Yu's eyes widened as he stared at her suspiciously. Then, he said with certainty, "You're in a bad mood." There was still a faint smile on Qin Chen's face. He put his hands in his pockets and did not deny it. "Yes, I'm not in a good mood." Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and reminded him gloomily, "Dr. Qin, you're a doctor." He didn't care about what happened last night because it was issue, but if this quack dared to use him as a punching bag now, the next second, that overly beautiful face was in front of him, and his voice was very low and hoarse. "What are you going to do?" "Well, stand up and fight with me, huh?" Lan Yu's face became even uglier. This wasn't just a quack, but a demon. He was livid and reached out to wave the person in front of him away. "I don't want you to treat me. I want to change the attending doctor." Qin Chen easily grabbed his arm and restrained him. Chapter 24:15. For Lan Yu, it was shameful. His hand was held by an excessively beautiful man and he could not fight back. At that moment, he was extremely embarrassed. He could not wait to get rid of this gigolo immediately. Qin Chen looked down at their intertwined hands. The entanglement of black and white was quite a visual impact. He smiled faintly. Sure. Let's see if the hospital approves it. Lan Yu gritted his teeth. I'll change to another hospital. Can't I? Yes, but I promise that in China, no one can cure your leg except for me. Qin Chen straightened his body and let go of his hand. Think about it carefully. Do you want to continue to be tortured by me or lie on the bed and accept a hopeless life? You might not be able to stand up in the future. Think about that situation. Lie down and draw. Lan Yu almost went crazy. He stared at this beautiful gigolo and could not do anything to him. Qin Chen's expression became serious. He glanced at the nurse. Is everything ready? It was he who spoiled these nurses so much that they did not do their proper work and only knew how to watch gossip. The nurse immediately ran out and closed the door. Qin Chen did not pay any more attention to Lan Yu. He walked directly to the window and stood quietly. Lan Yu lay down and looked sideways. He could see the side of Qin Chen's face. It was the kind of handsome man with good facial features. Especially the bridge of his nose, it was straight and elegant. His thin lips had a light pink color. He was a handsome man in a comic book style. Lan Yu was an artist himself. It was probably because the lines were too good that he looked at it for a long time. He kept looking at it and forgot to move his eyes away. Qin Chen's slender body was wrapped in a sweater and trousers of good quality. The white coat outside was spotless. No matter how one looked at him, he looked like an excellent young man. However, he was extremely bad-tempered. Lan Yu did not know how long he looked until Qin Chen's slightly hoarse voice sounded. Have you seen enough? Lan Yu was stunned. He coughed uncomfortably. Have you broken up? So you are in a bad mood. Qin Chen quietly looked back at Lan Yu. His red phoenix eyes slightly narrowed. That was a signal that he did not want to be seen through. His thin lips even curled up slightly with a touch of mockery. Do you think I have a girlfriend? Lan Yu heard from the nurse that Qin Chen was only 22 years old. To him, he was still too young to grow hair on his lips. But compared with Qin Mu, Qin Chen was obviously much more experienced, so it was not strange that he had a girlfriend. However, she didn't know what kind of woman could control Qin Chen's temper. He was too hard to understand. Just as they were talking, the nurse came in. As soon as she came in, she felt that the atmosphere inside was not right. However, the nurse did not say much. Qin Yun Lan, she said. Mr. Lan Yu, prepare it for Mr. Lan Yu as well. Qin Chen's voice was especially indifferent. The nurse nodded and smiled awkwardly at Lan Yu. Mr. Lan, we're going to do it. As she said that, she waved her chicken claw in the air. After all, Mr. Lan was still very repulsed by the t-shirt. Sure enough, as soon as the nurse finished speaking, Lan Yu frowned slightly. I'll do it myself. The nurse's voice became even softer. Believe me, Mr. Lan, you can't do it yourself. Lan Yu suddenly exploded. I don't even know how to take off a pair of pants. After that, he panted. The air was full of embarrassment. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.